Section 1. The show that was never just a show. Picture a quiet Sunday night in January 1999. The Super Bowl has just ended. Millions of people across America are still in their living rooms, snacks half-eaten, settling into that familiar post-game haze where nobody really wants to move yet. And then something comes on television that nobody was quite prepared for. A cartoon family. A round-headed father who is not particularly smart. A mother trying to hold things together with patience and occasional exasperation. A teenage daughter that nobody seems to notice. A teenage son who is sweet but lost. A baby who speaks like a Victorian stage villain. And a dog drinking a martini. Family Guy arrived in the world not with a whisper but with around 22 million viewers watching that first episode on Fox. And what happened over the next 25-plus years is one of the most fascinating and layered stories in the history of animated television. The show got canceled. It came back. It got canceled again. It came back again. And through all of that, it somehow embedded itself so deeply into the fabric of American pop culture that even people who have never watched a complete episode can recognize the characters on sight. But here is the thing that tends to get overlooked. Family Guy was never really just a cartoon about a silly family getting into ridiculous situations. Underneath the fart jokes and the chicken fights and the random cutaways and the shock value, there was always something else going on, something quieter, something more personal and, in many ways, more honest than the show's creators were always willing to admit out loud. Seth MacFarlane built Family Guy around characters that were exaggerated, yes, but they were exaggerated versions of real things, real anxieties, real failures, real longing. Real confusion about who we are and what we owe the people we love. The Griffin family, dysfunctional as they are, reflects something that a lot of American households carry around quietly, buried beneath the daily noise of school and work and bar trips and arguments about what to watch on television. And so what we are going to do in this video, in this long, slow, atmospheric exploration that you can let wash over you while you drift, is peel back the layers of this show one at a time. We are going to look at what Family Guy was actually saying across all of its seasons about working-class life, about the weight of unfulfilled dreams, about the particular sadness of being a teenager who feels invisible, about what happens when intelligence becomes a mask instead of a genuine quality, about what men actually want from their friendships even if they are never going to say it out loud, about how religion and death and the afterlife get treated when you strip away the reverence and just let a cartoon be honest. The writing and what follows is meant to be slow and immersive. You can let it fill the room like ambient sound. You do not have to catch every detail. These ideas will sink in at whatever depth feels right for wherever you are right now. So get comfortable. Pull something warm over you if you have it. And let's talk about what was really going on inside Family Guy all along. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I genuinely love seeing those someone watching from a rainy city, or a quiet countryside, or a late-night bedroom on the other side of the world. And if you want more of these long-form, relaxed deep dives, hit subscribe. It helps enormously and it means more nights like this one. Section 2. The Griffin Family as a Mirror of American Working-Class Anxiety. Let us start with the foundation. The family itself. Because before you can understand what any individual character means, or what specific scenes were hiding beneath the humor, you have to understand what the Griffin family represents as a unit. And what they represent is something deeply, uncomfortably specific to the American experience of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. When Seth MacFarlane was designing what would eventually become the Griffin family, he started with a very particular kind of household. Not wealthy, not destitute. Somewhere in that middle zone that American culture has always told itself is the normal place to be, the aspirational destination, the proof that things are working out. A house in the suburbs of Rhode Island, a working father, a stay-at-home mother, children in school, a dog, a fence out front, the whole image of domestic stability that an entire generation of Americans was taught to understand as the goal. The Griffins have that image, they live inside it, but the show, almost from the very beginning, is interested in what that image costs. Peter Griffin works at a brewery. Before that, he worked at a toy factory. He is not a man with a career so much as a man with a job. There is a significant difference, and the show understood that difference even when it was not being explicit about it. A career implies direction, intention, a sense that today connects to some future version of yourself that is larger and more accomplished. A job is what you do to get money so that the other things in your life can happen. Peter is very much a job person. He shows up, he collects his pay, he goes home, he goes to the bar, he watches television, he repeats. And the show is not cruel about this in its early seasons. The early episodes understand that Peter's life is not a failure by the standards he has been given. He has a wife who loves him. He has kids who are, in their various ways, still developing and full of potential. He has friends who genuinely enjoy his company. He owns his home. By the metrics that middle-class American life hands you, Peter is doing fine. But underneath all of that doing fine is a deep, almost never-spoken current of unease. The theme song of Family Guy is itself a key to understanding this. The lyrics, which Peter and Lois perform in a showbiz style while the family dances around them, ask directly, "It seems today that all we see is violence in movies and sex on TV, but where are those good old-fashioned values on which we used to rely?" That question sounds like nostalgia. It sounds like the complaint of someone who wants things to go back to the way they were. But listen to it a second time. The question is not answered. The show never really answers it, and that is the point. The Griffin family is singing that song every week, and every week the answer is the same messy, chaotic household they have always had. The good old-fashioned values are nowhere to be found, and somehow, life continues anyway. The family continues anyway. The show is making a quiet argument that the values we are nostalgic for may never have been real in the first place, and that the actual life underneath the image of family stability has always been more complicated, more funny, more painful, and more human than the image was ever willing to show. The town of Quahog, Rhode Island, where all of this takes place, is itself a kind of compression of American suburban life into a single setting. It has a church, a bar, a diner, a police department, a news station, a school, everything that a community needs to function. And yet within that setting, almost nothing functions well. The police are ineffective or corrupt depending on which episode you are watching. The news is sensationalist. The church is populated by people who follow its rules without necessarily believing in anything those rules are pointing toward. The school struggles to connect with the young people it is supposed to be educating. All of this is comedic, yes, but it is also a fairly accurate portrait of the way that American institutions look to a lot of working-class families in the late 1990s and 2000s. The trust in those institutions was already eroding. The sense that the systems around you were designed with your well-being in mind was giving way to a more suspicious, more ironic relationship with authority. Family Guy captured that mood, often without being explicit about it. The class dynamics in the show are particularly interesting because they run in multiple directions at once. Peter is working class, and proud of it, and also occasionally ashamed of it when he is reminded that Lois comes from a family with serious money. Her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, is genuinely wealthy, the kind of wealthy that Peter is entirely unable to relate to, and that gap between their two worlds is a source of persistent, low-level tension in the show. Lois chose Peter over a more socially acceptable match. She chose love over class alignment, and the show presents that choice as noble and also as genuinely costly, because the life she ended up in is harder and less comfortable than the one she grew up in. This is not a small thing. The show is quietly aware that the decision to marry for love, one of the foundational stories that American culture tells about itself, one of the most romantic ideas built into the national myth, does not come without material consequences. Lois is a piano teacher who gave up a privileged life to be a mother in a house that is always slightly too chaotic. She is brilliant and capable and underutilized. And the show knows that even when it is making jokes about something else entirely, the children complete the picture of working-class anxiety in their own ways. Meg is the oldest, and she is a teenager trying to become a person in a household that does not give her much support for that process. Chris is academically struggling in a way that suggests nobody has ever really figured out how to reach him. Stewie is, on the surface, an evil genius, but under that, he is a baby who receives almost no genuine emotional connection from the adults around him. The family is not cruel so much as they are distracted. They are all dealing with their own things. Peter is trying to hold on to a sense of himself that is increasingly hard to justify. Lois is managing everyone and everything while simultaneously trying not to lose track of who she is beneath the role of wife and mother. The kids are growing up in the gap between what a family is supposed to provide and what this particular family can actually manage. And the show loves them for it. That is the thing that gets missed when people reduce Family Guy to its shock value and its edgy jokes. In its bones, the show has a tremendous amount of affection for this specific type of household, for the messiness of it, for the way people who are not very good at being a family still choose to keep being one every single day without making a big deal about it. That is the hidden message at the center of the Griffin family portrait. Not that dysfunctional families are funny, though they are. Not that working-class life is sad, though it carries its own weight. The hidden message is that love and loyalty in an imperfect household are not lesser things than love and loyalty in a picture-perfect one. They might actually be stronger, precisely because they are tested every day and they keep holding. The Griffins are not a family that succeeds by any traditional measure. They are a family that survives. And in the world of the show, which is the world of a particular kind of American reality, survival with warmth intact is its own form of success. The show understood something that a lot of more prestigious television never quite grasped, which is that ordinary people doing ordinary things in ordinary places contain as much depth and as much worth as any other subject. The Griffins are not extraordinary. They are simply observed with enough care and enough honesty that they become something more than a punchline. They become recognizable. They become, in the deepest and most surprising sense, yours. So when you drift off to the sound of this and you think about Family Guy, think about that family not as a collection of jokes but as a portrait. A portrait of a particular moment in American working-class life, painted in bright colors with a lot of humor and more than a little sadness underneath. And the sadness is not a flaw in the painting. It is what makes the painting real. Section 3. Peter Griffin's Hidden Depth. The tragedy beneath the comedy. There is a scene that happens in multiple forms across many episodes of Family Guy, and it is easy to miss how much it reveals because it is usually played for a quick laugh. Peter does something impulsive, something reckless, something that makes no logical sense and causes a small disaster. And then for just a moment, before the show moves on to the next thing, there is a beat. A tiny pause where Peter stands or sits or looks at whatever he has just broken, and there is something in his face that is not quite sure of itself, not quite innocent. It is something more like the look of a person who knows, on some level, that he is not living up to what he is supposed to be and cannot quite figure out how he got here or how to do differently. That moment is the real Peter Griffin. Everything else is costume. Peter Justin Griffin was not designed to be a villain. Seth MacFarlane made that very clear from the beginning. He was designed as a working-class father who loved his family, was not particularly intellectual, made bad decisions with some regularity, and at the end of the day came home and tried to be present in whatever imperfect way he could manage. In the first 3 seasons of the show, he was largely that person. But even in those early seasons, if you look closely, you can see the architecture of something more complicated. The show seeds Peter's backstory with real pain. His stepfather, Francis Griffin, was harsh and cold and repeatedly told Peter that he was not his real son, which was true. Francis made it clear through words and behavior that Peter was a disappointment, that he did not measure up, that the family's expectations of him were low, and Peter still managed to fall short of even those. That is a devastating thing to build into a character who is supposed to be the comedic heart of your show, and yet the writers did it, not as a plot device but as an explanation. Peter's impulsiveness, his inability to think before acting, his desperate hunger for validation from the people around him, the way he will completely abandon one personality and adopt another whenever someone tells him that a different way of being is cooler or better or more admirable, all of that becomes legible when you understand that Peter has never been told he is enough. He has never had someone in a position of authority say to him, "The way you are right now is valuable and good, keep going." Because of that, Peter spends his entire adult life in a kind of low-grade identity crisis that is so normalized he does not even recognize it as one. He chases trends not because he is shallow but because he is still, somewhere in his emotional core, a child looking for approval. He becomes obsessed with things, with bands, with hobbies, with causes, with identities, because each new thing represents a possible answer to the question he has never been able to ask out loud, which is this who I'm supposed to be? Will this make people think I am worth something? The bar, the drunken clam, is Peter's most honest place. When he is sitting there with Quagmire, Joe, and Cleveland, he is not performing. He is not trying to be anything in particular. He is just a man with a beer and his friends and the comfort of being accepted without having to justify himself. The drunken clam scenes in the early seasons carry a warmth that is easy to take for granted because they are so low-key. Nobody is making grand speeches. Nobody is solving problems. They are just sitting together, talking about nothing very important, and that is enough. That is everything, actually, for four men who, in their various ways, are not getting their emotional needs met anywhere else. Peter loves Lois in a way that the show sometimes buries under crude jokes, but never entirely abandons. In the early episodes especially, his affection for her is genuine and straightforward. He knows she is smarter than him. He knows she made a choice in marrying him that most people around her thought was a mistake. He carries a quiet gratitude for that choice that occasionally surfaces in moments where the comedy pauses, just long enough for something real to breathe. In the episode where Lois briefly becomes a model and is swept up into a different world, Peter's insecurity is played for laughs, but it is also genuinely sad. He is afraid of losing the one person who chose him fully, knowing everything that he was. The chicken fights deserve a special mention here, because they are one of the most persistently strange recurring bits in the show's history, and they hide something fascinating if you look at them long enough. Peter's epic battles with the giant chicken, which erupt with no warning and destroy everything around them, going on for minutes, burning through locations and set pieces with complete disregard for any other story the episode was trying to tell, are often read as simple, absurdist comedy. And they are funny. But they are also, in a strange way, the most physically honest thing Peter does. Everything else in his life requires him to be passive, to accept things, to absorb whatever comes at him without real resistance. The chicken fight is the one context where Peter goes fully, completely, without any restraint whatsoever. He does not calculate. He does not hold back. He does not wonder what other people will think. He just fights. The chicken is never explained. The original grudge, over a coupon that turned out to be expired, is too trivial to justify the scale of what follows. But that is the point. The grievance is small and the response is enormous. And in that gap between small grievance and enormous response, you have a picture of what it looks like when someone who has swallowed a lifetime of small indignities finally stops swallowing one of them. Peter's relationship with the chicken is ridiculous and also, on some level, the most human thing about him. His relationship with his children, in the early seasons before the characterization drifted into more extreme territory, was one of the most underrated parts of the show's emotional architecture. He was not a good father in any traditional sense. He was distracted and impulsive, and often more interested in his own moment than in whatever his children needed. But there were these threads of real affection that ran through the early episodes, moments where Peter looked at one of his kids and something genuine flickered across his face. He is not a man who is good at expressing love. He is a man who feels it and cannot find the language for it, and so it comes out sideways, in impulsive gestures and poorly executed attempts at involvement. In one early episode, when Peter thinks he might be dying, he spends his last hours trying to give each of his children something meaningful. His method is characteristically Peter, fumbling and misguided and more about what he wants to give than what they actually need. But the impulse underneath it is real. He wants to matter to them. He wants to leave them something worth having. He wants, in the most fundamental possible way, to have been a good father even if the execution has been consistently terrible. There is also the matter of Peter's intelligence, or rather, what the show was doing with the way it depicted that intelligence. In the early seasons, Peter was not smart, but he was not empty either. He had a particular kind of practical cunning, a way of solving problems that was entirely his own and that occasionally, accidentally, worked. He understood people in a way that transcended education. He could read a room, at least some of the time. He had genuine opinions about things that were formed through experience rather than reflection, and those opinions were not always wrong. The show was drawing from a long tradition of working-class characters who are underestimated because they lack formal education, and whose intelligence shows up in ways that more credentialed characters tend to miss. Peter is not dumb so much as he is uneducated in the formal sense, which is not the same thing. His emotional intelligence is low. His strategic thinking is poor. But his humanity, his capacity for loyalty and warmth, and the kind of blunt honesty that comes from not being trained to package your thoughts diplomatically, that is real and it matters. What the show was saying, underneath all of the comedy, is something quite pointed about how American culture values intelligence. Brian, the dog with the Ivy League pretensions and the unfinished novel, is presented as the smart one. But Brian's intelligence, as the show develops, turns out to be largely performative. He talks about books he has not fully digested. He lectures people about ideas he has not fully worked through. He claims a moral and intellectual superiority that his actual behavior does not support. Peter, for all his foolishness, actually shows up. He is actually present. He does not, in the early seasons, pretend to be something he is not. And there is an argument to be made, which the show is quietly making, that the kind of groundedness and authenticity that Peter represents is worth more, in real practical terms, than the kind of elaborate self-presentation that Brian has built his entire identity around. That argument is most visible in the moments when Peter and Brian are together, and the dynamic between them shifts unexpectedly. There are scenes where Brian, mid-lecture, looks at Peter and realizes that Peter is not listening because he is not interested, and the show turns that into a joke about Peter's limited attention span. But there is another way to read those moments. Peter is not interested because he already knows, on some instinctive level, that what Brian is saying does not connect to anything real, and his disinterest is, in a strange way, its own form of clarity. Peter Griffin is, in the end, a portrait of a particular kind of American man, the kind who was handed a world that made certain promises to him, and then watched those promises quietly fail to materialize, and who found a way to keep going anyway. Not heroically, not with great insight or elegant coping mechanisms, just with a beer and some friends and a wife who still chooses him every morning and a house full of kids who are, despite everything, still growing. That is the tragedy at the center of Peter Griffin, and it is also the quiet grace of him. He is not a hero. He is barely even a good person in many of the later seasons, but in his best moments he is something more than a punchline. He is a man carrying the weight of ordinary life with a kind of blundering, persistent love that the show never quite manages to take away from him completely, no matter how far it pushes him in other directions. Section 4. Brian Griffin's Secret Existential Crisis. Of all the characters in Family Guy, Brian Griffin is the one whose hidden depth is most directly stated, which is part of what makes him so interesting to sit with. The show tells you, repeatedly and sometimes with surprising directness, that Brian is a creature in crisis. A dog who taught himself to be a person and is haunted by the gap between what he has become and what he wanted to be. Brian Griffin is 10 years old in dog years. He has the emotional range of a middle-aged man who peaked somewhere in his mid-30s and has been quietly declining since. He drinks martinis because that is the drink of a certain type of sophistication he is reaching toward. He drives a Prius because it signals the right kind of political awareness. He talks about books with the enthusiasm of someone who wants you to know he reads books, which is slightly different from actually loving books for what they are. He is, in other words, a type. A very specific and very recognizable type. The person who built an identity out of cultural consumption and intellectual posturing, and who, somewhere along the way, confused those things with actually having a self. Seth MacFarlane voiced Brian in his own natural speaking voice, which was a deliberate choice. Brian is the character through whom MacFarlane expresses his own perspective most directly, his atheism, his political liberalism, his frustrations with the people around him who do not seem to engage with the world as thoughtfully as he does. And the fact that the show also makes Brian wrong about almost everything he is smug about, that the show makes his pretension the subject of consistent mockery, says something interesting about MacFarlane's relationship to his own self-image. There is a self-awareness in that choice, a willingness to hold up the mirror and let the reflection be unflattering. The unfinished novel is the most important thing about Brian. It is mentioned in the first season, briefly, as one of those biographical details that gives the character texture. Brian is working on a novel called Faster Than the Speed of Love. Years pass. Seasons accumulate. The novel remains unfinished. It becomes one of the most consistent running jokes in the entire series, and like the best running jokes, it gradually stops being just a joke and starts being something else. A statement. A portrait of creative paralysis so familiar and so specific that it would make many viewers cringe in recognition. Because who among the people watching Family Guy has not had some version of the unfinished novel? Some project, some ambition, some creative work or career aspiration, or plan for the future that has been sitting in a drawer, or a hard drive, or a mental backburner for years, always being postponed, always being protected from actual completion by the very ambition that gave rise to it? If you finish the thing, it has to be judged. And if it is judged, it might be found lacking. And if it is found lacking, then the identity you built around being the kind of person who has that ambition collapses. The unfinished work is a shield. Brian is also an alcoholic, and the show treats this with a strange combination of comedy and honesty that is one of its most interesting qualities. Brian drinks constantly. He drinks in the morning. He drinks when he is depressed, which is often. He drinks when he is celebrating, which is rarely. He drinks in the car, which the show occasionally acknowledges is a problem and more often simply accepts as part of who he is. The drinking is not presented as a dark and serious storyline most of the time. It is presented as a character trait, a quirk, one of the things that makes Brian who he is. But if you watch the cumulative effect of all those drinks across all those episodes, a picture emerges. Brian drinks because he is in pain. Not the dramatic, operatic kind of pain that generates big story moments, but the quieter, more chronic pain of being someone who knows himself well enough to be disappointed, but not well enough to change. He knows he is pretentious. He knows his novel is never going to be written. He knows his romantic relationships fail because he approaches them with the wrong priorities. He knows he uses people. He knows all of this, and the knowing does not help, which is why the glass is always in his hand. There is an episode called Brian and Stewie, Season 8, where the two of them get locked in a bank vault overnight. No cutaways, no main plot, just two characters in a small space, talking. It is widely considered one of the best episodes the show ever produced, and the reason is that it strips away everything that Family Guy normally uses to keep its characters at arm's length from genuine emotion and forces them into direct contact with their own truths. Brian tells Stewie in that episode that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box. He keeps it there because there are days when he cannot be trusted with easy access to it. He has thought about ending his own life. He has gotten close enough to that thought that he decided the safest thing was to put distance between himself and the means of it. This is a remarkable thing for a primetime animated comedy to put in the mouth of a beloved character. It is not played for shock, it is played quietly. Stewie asks him why he keeps going if he feels that way. Brian says because of Stewie. Because there is someone who needs him. And the episode closes with a kind of imperfect, alcohol-soaked, slightly awkward mutual acknowledgement that they matter to each other. It is not a resolution. It is not a cure. It is just two beings in a vault holding on. That episode reveals what was always true about Brian but usually buried under the comedy. He is not actually the smooth, composed intellectual he presents to the world. He is a deeply lonely creature who found language and culture and wit and used them to build a version of himself that could navigate human spaces, and who discovered too late that navigating human spaces is not the same as belonging to them. He is also a dog, and the show in its most interesting moments does not let that go entirely. There are scenes throughout the series where Brian's animal nature breaks through his carefully constructed persona. He chases a ball despite himself. He reacts to a squirrel with an instinct he cannot suppress. He sees in black and white, which is mentioned almost as an aside but carries its own metaphorical weight. Brian has built a world of nuance and complexity and sophisticated human preference, but his actual sensory experience of that world is fundamentally limited in ways he cannot overcome. He cannot see all the colors. He experiences the world through filters he did not choose. His relationship with Stewie is the most important relationship on the show, in the later seasons especially, and it works because it is built on a particular kind of honest need that neither character would ever be able to express to anyone else. Stewie needs Brian because Brian is the only person who actually sees him, who takes him seriously, who does not look at a baby in a high chair and dismiss what is happening behind those eyes. Brian needs Stewie because Stewie is the only person who holds Brian accountable without doing so cruelly, who can call Brian on his pretensions and his failures in a way that Brian is actually able to hear. They are, in other words, each other's one honest relationship in a world full of performance. And that dynamic, two characters who are slightly misfitted for the worlds they inhabit, finding in each other the one place where the performance can drop, is one of the most genuinely touching things the show ever put on screen. The hidden message in Brian's story is about the particular grief of unrealized potential. He is intelligent enough to have done great things. He is honest enough, in his best moments, to know he has not. The gap between what he could have been and what he actually is sits in him like a stone. He carries it with every drink. He circles it with every half-hearted attempt at writing. He runs from it into every new romantic obsession that fails because he has never figured out how to be present enough in a relationship for it to grow into something real. He is also, despite all of that, genuinely lovable. The show makes sure of this. For every moment where Brian is insufferable, there is a moment where his care for the people around him, real care, not the performed kind, surfaces unexpectedly and lands with weight. He is the one who notices when something is wrong. He is the one who, in the early seasons especially, stays with the person who is struggling even when he does not know what to say. Brian Griffin is not just a comedic character. He is a meditation on what it costs to be self-aware without being self-accepting. And his story is not a happy one, but it is an honest one. And in the context of a show that builds most of its humor around keeping things comfortable and detached, his honesty is quietly radical. Section 5. Stewie Griffin's Unspoken Longing for Love. Let us spend some time with the most theatrical member of the Griffin household. Stewie Griffin, 1-year-old, British accent, murderous instincts, genius-level intellect, and a relationship to his own emotions so complicated and deeply buried that it took the show nearly 25 years to begin articulating it clearly. In Season 1, Stewie was simple, not in the sense of being uncomplicated, because he was always extraordinarily complicated, but simple in the sense of having a clear, driving purpose. He wanted to kill Lois. He wanted to dominate the world. He built weapons in his bedroom with a calm efficiency that belied his size. He monologued at people who could not hear him about plans so elaborate that they required their own flowcharts. He was, essentially, a Bond villain in a onesie. And the comedy was entirely about that contrast. The gap between what he looked like and what he was thinking is one of the funniest recurring visual jokes in television history. But even in those early episodes, if you watch carefully, you can see the edges of something else. The weapons and the schemes and the world domination plotting are, when you think about it, the activities of a child who has found an extremely elaborate way to fill the void left by not receiving enough actual love and attention. Lois loves Stewie in the way that an overwhelmed mother loves a baby she does not understand. She picks him up. She feeds him. She changes him. She sings to him. She does all the external things that maternal love looks like. But the actual Stewie, the one who lives behind the British accent and the supervillain monologues, that Stewie she has never once seen. She responds to the surface. The diaper, the high chair, the bottle, she has no idea what is happening in the mind of the child she is caring for. And the show treats this as comedy, which it is, because the contrast between Stewie's inner experience and Lois's experience of him is inherently funny. But it is also a very specific kind of sadness. Stewie's matricidal obsession, his burning desire to eliminate the person who is supposed to love him most, is not random. It is the externalization of a specific emotional injury. He has been seen and not understood. He has been present in a family and made to feel invisible within it. And he has responded by building an inner world so elaborate and so self-sufficient that he does not need anyone in it, which is exactly the kind of thing a person does when they desperately need people in it. The British accent is its own kind of message. Stewie was born in Rhode Island. His family is thoroughly American. He has no objective reason to speak like a character from a 1940s stage production. The accent is entirely constructed, adopted, worn as a kind of armor that marks him as different, as belonging to a different category of being than the people around him. It is a child's very sophisticated way of saying, I am not like you, and you cannot hurt me, because the standards by which you would judge me do not apply to me. Everyone uses that tactic at some point. The teenager who adopts a distinctive subculture identity, the adult who constructs a professional persona so carefully that their personal life barely exists outside of it. The person who reads constantly and quotes philosophy because it is easier to be interesting than to be vulnerable. Stewie does it at a more theatrical scale than most, but the underlying mechanism is the same. His relationship with Rupert, the teddy bear, is one of the most telling things about him. Rupert cannot respond. Rupert cannot hurt him. Rupert accepts everything Stewie offers without judgment and without condition. Stewie tells Rupert his plans. He includes Rupert in his schemes. He treats Rupert as a genuine companion, a confidant, the one being in his world who receives the full version of who Stewie actually is. And when the show, in later seasons, has Brian destroy Rupert, the response is not played entirely for comedy. Something real breaks in Stewie in that moment. Something that the show acknowledges, briefly, with a kind of gentleness that its more chaotic episodes do not always allow for. The evolution of Stewie across the seasons is sometimes criticized as a betrayal of the original character, and there is something to that argument. The evil genius baby who plotted world domination was irreplaceable, and the show retired him too quickly and replaced him with something more generic. But the direction the show moved Stewie in was not random or thoughtless. It followed a logical emotional trajectory, even if that trajectory was sometimes handled clumsily. As Stewie grows in his friendship with Brian, as the world domination plots fade into the background, what emerges is a character who is, underneath everything, extremely lonely and extremely hungry for genuine connection. The road to episodes, where Brian and Stewie travel together and are forced into each other's company for extended periods, work because they allow Stewie to be exactly that thing: lonely, needing, forming, over the course of each adventure, a kind of bond with Brian that is the closest thing to a reciprocal relationship either of them has in their lives. In the 300th episode of the show, titled Send in Stewie, Please, the show does something remarkable. It confines Stewie to a therapy session with a school psychologist, played by Sir Ian McKellen, and it allows the character to dismantle himself slowly over the course of the episode. The fake voice comes out. The performance drops. What remains is a child who is genuinely scared, genuinely confused about who he is, genuinely aware that the version of himself he presents to the world is not the version that exists underneath. The therapist asks Stewie about his British accent, and Stewie admits in that episode that it is something he adopted, that it is not the voice he was born with, that somewhere under all the theater is a different Stewie who sounds like a regular American child. And the moment that version of his voice emerges, Stewie is horrified. Not because the real voice is bad, but because it is unprotected. It has no performance wrapped around it. It is just the voice of a child who is afraid. That episode is the most explicit the show ever gets about what Stewie's entire character is hiding. But it is pointing at something that was always there, from the very beginning. Stewie is not a villain. He is a child who decided very early that if he could not be loved completely, he would be powerful completely, and that he would perform that power so thoroughly that nobody would ever suspect the thing he was actually after. What he was actually after is what almost every child is after: presence, attention that is not perfunctory, a parent who looks at you and does not see the surface thing but the actual thing inside, a sense that the person who is supposed to love you most actually knows you. Stewie never gets that from Lois. Not really. He gets it, imperfectly, from Brian. And that imperfect getting is what the later seasons are really about, underneath the comedy and the adventure and the time travel and the increasingly elaborate pop culture references. Stewie Griffin is a child who invented a world for himself because the world he was given was not quite enough. And in the spaces between the genius and the megalomania and the theatrical cruelty, he is one of the most quietly heartbreaking figures the show ever put on screen. Section 6. Meg Griffin and the show's darkest social commentary. Here is where the show's intentions and the show's effects start to split apart in ways that are genuinely interesting to trace. Meg Griffin is the character who reveals most clearly the distance between what Family Guy thought it was saying and what it was actually saying. And both of those things, what it thought and what it was, carry real meaning. In the first 3 seasons of the show, Meg was the normal one. The show never let you forget that, in a household containing an impulsive, sometimes dangerous father, a mother with hidden depths of moral complexity, a baby who built weapons and plotted murder, and a talking dog fighting off existential dread with a cocktail glass, the most extraordinary thing in the house was the completely ordinary teenage girl, with the pink hat and the average grades and the social struggles that any teenager might recognize. That was the joke. Not that Meg was pathetic. The joke was the contrast. Everyone around her was operating on some elevated or exaggerated plane of absurdity, and Meg was just trying to get through high school with a reasonable number of friends and some sense of who she might want to become. In the context of the Griffin household, that ordinary aspiration was the punchline. The normalcy was the gag. But then something shifted. The show discovered that making fun of Meg generated a specific kind of response from the audience, and it leaned into that response without stopping to examine what kind of comedy it was making. The jokes about her being boring gave way to jokes about her being ugly, then to jokes about her being unwanted, then to a sustained, multi-season campaign of abuse so persistent that the Meg Griffin experience became inseparable from the idea of being the person that everyone despises for no articulable reason. This is where the social commentary that the show was accidentally making starts to become visible. Because what Family Guy was depicting in the Meg storyline, however unintentionally in its execution, was the experience of being the designated recipient of a group's displaced anxiety. The psychological term that gets used for this in family systems work is the identified patient. In a dysfunctional family system, there is often one member who becomes the container for everything the family cannot deal with directly. The identified patient absorbs the dysfunction so that everyone else can maintain the fiction that they are fine. Meg is the identified patient of the Griffin household. When Peter is frustrated, he directs it at Meg. When Lois is overwhelmed, Meg becomes the outlet. When Chris is confused, Meg is the safe target because she does not have the social power to retaliate effectively. Even Brian, who in his best moments is the most ethically aware member of the household, participates in the pile-on because it is easier to join in than to be the one person who says, "Wait, this is not right." The show made this explicit in the season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party and then immediately retreated from it. Meg, during a hurricane that traps the family inside together, finally says out loud everything that has been building for years. She calls out her father's cruelty, her mother's passivity in the face of it, her brother's cowardice. She names the dynamic with a clarity that the show had never previously allowed her, and the effect on the family is immediate. Without Meg to serve as their shared outlet, they turn on each other. The family system collapses because the function it was depending on has been removed. The episode's resolution, in which Meg accepts her role back, agrees to continue being the lightning rod, is presented as a kind of maturity on her part, a recognition that someone has to absorb the dysfunction for the family to function. It is, in the context of the show, framed as sacrifice, as Meg being, in her own way, stronger than everyone else. And here is where the show's hidden message becomes genuinely disturbing, because there is a real psychological phenomenon that the show is describing, accurately, which is that many families do have an identified patient. Many families do have a member who carries the weight of the group's pathology so that everyone else can function. And the tragedy of that role is that the person in it usually stays in it, not because they are weak, but because they love their family enough to keep taking the hits. Meg's love for her family, underneath all the abuse and the dismissal and the cruelty, is the most genuine and most selfless thing in the show. She keeps coming back. She keeps reaching out. She keeps trying, despite overwhelming evidence that her efforts will not be received with the warmth they deserve. And the show repeatedly confirms that she is right to keep trying, that the love underneath all the dysfunction is real, while also consistently refusing to let that love change anything structurally. What the show was saying in aggregate across years of Meg's story is something bleak and also something honest about the way some family systems actually work. That love is not enough to fix dysfunction. That recognizing a pattern does not automatically break it. That the person who sees most clearly what is wrong is often the person with the least power to change it. And that survival in a damaging system sometimes means becoming complicit in your own mistreatment, because the alternative is a kind of rupture that feels more dangerous than the abuse. Meg Griffin is the show's conscience. She is the character who, if you look at her clearly and take her seriously, makes you aware of everything the other characters are getting away with. And the joke, the real hidden joke that is not very funny at all, is that she knows this and stays anyway. Because they are her family. Because she loves them. Because home, even a hard one, is still home. Mila Kunis, who has voiced Meg since season 2, has spoken about the experience of receiving the cruelty that the character was treated with, of having people quote the show's most dismissive lines toward her in real life, directed at the real woman behind the voice. The fiction bled into the real world in exactly the way that meaningful fiction sometimes does. The message was received, people absorbed it, and the message they absorbed, across years of watching Meg be treated as beneath consideration, was something about which kinds of people are allowed to be seen and which are expected to remain invisible. The later seasons, beginning around season 14 or 15, and continuing forward, did begin to course correct. The extreme abuse diminished. Meg was given more episodes where she was competent and capable and interesting in her own right. The shift is often credited, in part, to the addition of more women to the writing staff, people who looked at what had been happening to the show's main teenage girl character and recognized it as something other than comedy. But even accounting for that correction, Meg's story remains the most uncomfortable part of Family Guy's legacy. Not because it was doing something entirely wrong. It was doing something that was sometimes honest and sometimes pointed, and occasionally even brave. But it was also, without always meaning to be, demonstrating how easy it is to normalize cruelty when it is directed at someone who has been designated as socially invisible. And that demonstration is its own kind of message, uncomfortable as it is to receive. Section 7. Lois Griffin, the saint who wasn't. Lois Griffin walks a very precise line in Family Guy's world, and the show is at its most interesting when it acknowledges how deliberately she is walking that line and how much effort it takes her to maintain her balance on it. On the surface, Lois is the straight man of the household, the one who provides the baseline of sanity against which everyone else's chaos is measured. She is the adult in the room, usually. The voice that says, "We cannot do that," or "That is not how things work," or "Peter, we need to talk." She is patient and loving and occasionally exasperated and always managing. But the show, particularly in the moments when it is being most honest about who Lois actually is, gives us something much more complicated. Lois Pewterschmidt Griffin is a woman who made a radical choice and then spent decades dealing with its consequences. She came from wealth. She had the education, the social exposure, the aesthetic sensibility of someone raised in a particular kind of privilege. And she walked away from it, by choice, to marry a man her family considered beneath her, to build a life in a small house in a working-class neighborhood, to raise 3 children with all of the challenges and none of the resources she grew up with. The show treats this choice with respect, which it should, but it also traces the cost of it with more honesty than it usually gets credit for. Lois is not bitter about the life she chose, not exactly. But there are episodes where something surfaces in her, some memory of who she was going to be or might have been, and the show lets that surface briefly before covering it back over with whatever comedic obligation the episode has. In the episodes where Lois briefly becomes a model, or a pilot, or takes on some identity outside of wife and mother, the show explores with unusual directness what it means to be a woman who has systematically subordinated her own ambitions to the requirements of her household. She is good at those other things. She is often very good at them. She has capabilities that the Griffin household simply never needed to develop. And the tragedy underneath the comedy of those episodes is the recognition that this kind of submerged capability is not unusual. It is in fact one of the most common experiences of women who made particular choices about how to structure their lives. Lois has a dark side, and the show is careful and consistent in establishing it. She is a kleptomaniac, a tendency that surfaces periodically across multiple seasons. She has a gambling problem. She has a history, hinted at across multiple flashbacks, of genuinely wild behavior in her younger years, behavior that does not square at all with the responsible, patient mother that is her primary public identity. Before Peter, before the children, before the house in Quahog, there was a Lois who did not have to manage anything, who could be impulsive and reckless and hungry for experience, without worrying about what it cost everyone else. The kleptomania in particular is interesting to think about as a psychological metaphor. Lois takes things. She cannot fully control the impulse to take things that are not hers. In a life defined by giving, by providing, by managing, by containing, the stealing represents a tiny, secret, compulsive act of taking for herself. Not taking anything she necessarily wants. Just taking. Just asserting, in the one way available to her in those moments, that she exists outside of her function. That there is a self in there that wants things, even if it is not quite sure what those things are. Her relationship with Peter is one of the show's most sustained examinations of what love looks like over time in an imperfect marriage. They argue, they miscommunicate. Peter does things that any reasonable person would find unforgivable, and Lois, more often than not, forgives them anyway. Not because she is passive or because she has no standards, but because she knows, on some level, that the comedy never quite articulates but never quite erases either, that Peter is trying. That underneath the chaos and the foolishness and the occasional genuine cruelty, there is a man who chose her and keeps choosing her and cannot always express what that choosing feels like but feels it nonetheless. The show is making, through the Lois and Peter relationship, a quiet and sometimes uncomfortable argument about what long-term love actually looks like when you strip away the cinematic version of it. It does not look like constant romance and perfect understanding and grand gestures of devotion. It looks like two people who have built something together, imperfectly, and who keep showing up to it not because it is easy, but because the alternative, the pulling apart, the dismantling of the thing they made, feels like a loss neither of them can afford. Lois is also, the show suggests more than once, capable of a darkness that goes beyond the kleptomania and the gambling. There are episodes where Lois gets what she wants through manipulation, where she leverages her understanding of Peter's emotional needs to steer him in the direction she has already decided he should go, where the patient, reasonable facade drops just long enough to reveal someone who is very much playing a game and is very good at it. These moments are played as comedy, usually, but they raise the question of whether Lois's patience is always as generous as it looks, or whether it sometimes masks a strategic calculation that she prefers to keep invisible. The answer the show settles on, across its best episodes, is that Lois is all of these things simultaneously. She is genuinely loving and also strategically self-protective. She is genuinely patient and also occasionally cold. She is the best thing that happened to the Griffin family, and also a person with her own unmet needs and her own suppressed ambitions and her own complicated relationship to the choices she made. She is, in other words, a real person in cartoon form, which is both the show's greatest achievement with her character and the most consistently overlooked thing about her. Section 8. Quagmire, Joe, and Cleveland. What the side characters really represent. The Drunken Clam is more than a bar. The four men who sit in it, Peter and his three friends, represent something that the show never quite names out loud, but returns to again and again across hundreds of episodes. They represent the particular texture of adult male friendship in America, with all of its warmth and all of its limitations and all of the things it manages to provide, in spite of not being designed to provide those things. Glenn Quagmire is the most complex of the three supporting characters, which is not immediately obvious because he is most legible as a one-note joke. He is hypersexual. He pursues women with a complete absence of restraint or self-awareness. His catchphrase is essentially a verbal symbol for his inability to think about anything except sexual opportunity. On the surface, he is crude and shallow, and the show treats him accordingly. But the show also, with some consistency, opens small windows into what is underneath that performance. Quagmire is a retired Navy pilot, and in the episodes that actually explore his military service, a different kind of character becomes briefly visible. Someone who was, at some point, genuinely capable of focus, of discipline, of the kind of sustained commitment that flying a military aircraft requires. That person did not disappear. He is still in there, somewhere behind the giggity and the revolving door of one-night encounters. Quagmire also, the show establishes, is genuinely lonely. Not in a way he acknowledges or would accept being seen in, but in the way that his constant pursuit of physical intimacy functions as a substitute for the other kind of intimacy that he either cannot access or has decided is too dangerous. He is a man who has optimized for connection of one type and foreclosed on connection of the other, and the optimization, like all optimizations, extracts a cost. The episode about his sister Anne, who has been in a long-term abusive relationship, is one of the most unexpectedly earnest things the show ever did. Quagmire's response to his sister's situation, his fury, his helplessness, his willingness to do something genuinely dangerous to remove a threat from her life, reveals a depth of care that his normal behavior makes entirely invisible. He is not the shallow predator the surface character suggests. He is a man who compartmentalized something and has been living in the compartment ever since. Joe Swanson is equally layered beneath the surface reading. He was introduced in the first season as a hero, the neighbor who had served, who had been injured in the line of duty, who carried his disability with dignity, and continued to be a capable, respected presence in the community. Early Joe is aspirational. He is the person the other men look up to, including Peter, who was initially jealous of Joe's standing in the neighborhood. The slow erosion of Joe across the seasons, as the show stripped him of dignity and turned his wheelchair from a character trait into a punchline, is one of the more uncomfortable patterns in Family Guy's history. But even in the later seasons, there are moments where Joe's original characterization reasserts itself. Moments where the man who chose service, who was shaped by discipline and by sacrifice, is visible underneath the increasingly pathetic comedic treatment. Joe represents something the show understood from the beginning, but forgot how to honor as the seasons accumulated. He represents the particular American ideal of masculine competence, the man who does the hard thing, who answers when called, who accepts the cost of service without complaint. That ideal is genuinely worthy of respect, and the show's inability to maintain its respect for Joe, its drift toward making him an object of pity, mirrors something happening in the broader culture's relationship to that ideal, a loss of clarity about how to honor a particular kind of sacrifice without flattening the person who made it. Cleveland Brown, patient and deliberate, is the most emotionally intelligent member of the friend group, and also the one the show consistently underuses. His slow burn delivery, his tendency to respond to Peter's chaos with a weary but affectionate steadiness, his availability to the people around him even when those people are clearly exhausting him. These qualities add up to a portrait of a particular kind of friendship that does not announce itself loudly but holds everything else together. Cleveland's departure to his own spin-off show, The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013, and his eventual return to Family Guy, reflects something real about the dynamics of male friendship in the working class. Friends scatter. Life pulls people into different configurations, and then sometimes for reasons that are practical or nostalgic, or simply because the orbit brings people back into proximity, they reconvene. The reconvening carries its own freight, a recognition that time has passed and things have changed, and the friendship exists now in a new form, shaped by experiences that the original group did not share. Together, the four men at the Drunken Clam represent the full spectrum of how adult men in America tend to navigate their emotional lives. Peter by avoiding introspection through activity and chaos. Quagmire by pursuing physical intensity as a substitute for emotional depth. Joe by disciplining himself into a role that leaves little room for softness. Cleveland by maintaining an equanimity that is part gift and part coping strategy. None of them are fully equipped for the emotional dimensions of their lives. None of them talk about that with each other in direct terms, and yet they show up, reliably, at the same table, and something real is transmitted in those hours together, something that each of them needs and none of them could name. That is one of the truest things Family Guy ever captured. The way that men who are not good at articulating love still manage to love each other, imperfectly and indirectly and across the table over drinks, in a way that matters enormously even when it looks like nothing very much at all. Section 9. The Town as a Character. Hidden World Building in Quahog. The town of Quahog, Rhode Island is not just a backdrop. Any show that runs for 25-plus seasons in the same setting inevitably makes that setting into something more than scenery. Quahog accumulates. It builds up layers of history and character and internal logic until it becomes as much a part of the show's identity as any of the people who live in it. Rhode Island itself is significant. Seth MacFarlane attended the Rhode Island School of Design in Providence, and his relationship to the state, the specific texture of New England working class and academic culture that Rhode Island contains, shapes the show in ways that extend beyond the state being a neutral setting. Rhode Island is small, it has a self-contained quality. Its culture is particular in a way that the coasts on either side of it are not quite. It is neither Boston nor New York. It is its own thing, regional and specific, and Family Guy absorbs some of that specificity even when it is exaggerating everything else. The fictional town of Quahog, built on that foundation, is constructed as a version of Middle America that is geographically northeastern but aspirationally universal. The kinds of people who live there, the kinds of institutions that serve them, the kinds of concerns that animate community life, these are recognizable to audiences across the country, even though the specific setting is New England. That is a deliberate design choice. Quahog is meant to feel like everywhere, which means it can absorb stories and anxieties from all over American culture without requiring any particular local knowledge to follow. The Drunken Clam, which we have already touched on, is more than the four friends' regular gathering place. It is the show's primary thesis statement about community. A functioning local bar, in the world of Family Guy, is where people who might otherwise have nothing in common find themselves sharing a physical space and, over time, becoming something resembling a community. The regulars at the Drunken Clam do not need to like each other in any simple sense. They need to keep showing up. The showing up is the thing. This is an idea that has deep roots in American social thought. The philosopher Robert Putnam wrote extensively in works like Bowling Alone about the decline of informal civic association in America, the ways that people who used to join clubs, participate in community organizations, maintain neighborhoods, and inhabit third places between home and work began, over the latter decades of the 20th century, to pull back into private life. The Drunken Clam is exactly the kind of third place that Putnam was mourning. A place without a specific purpose beyond gathering. A place where the social bonds that tie people together outside of family and work are maintained through proximity and habit and the small shared experience of being present in the same room. Family Guy is, in part, a show about what it would mean to still have places like that. To still have the kind of community fabric that makes a town feel inhabited by actual people rather than occupied by isolated households. And the fact that the show runs the Drunken Clam as a place of warmth and comfort and genuine connection, even while it fills the rest of the town with dysfunction and absurdity, is itself a kind of argument. The bar is where the show is most optimistic about human beings. The church in Quahog is where the show is most complicated. The Griffin family attends church, Peter more reluctantly than Lois, and the show's treatment of the church reflects MacFarlane's own atheism, while also never quite being able to dismiss the community function that the church serves. The people in the congregation are not presented as foolish for being there. They are presented as people who have organized their social lives around a particular institution and who find real comfort in that organization. The show mocks the content of the belief, but not, usually, the human need that the belief addresses. This is a more honest and more thoughtful position than it sometimes gets credit for. MacFarlane has said publicly that he is an atheist and that he is bewildered by religious belief in the 21st century. But the show he made cannot quite dismiss what religion does for people even while it refuses to take seriously what religion says it is. That tension is productive and interesting, and it runs through almost every episode that touches on faith or spirituality. The school system, Adam West High School in the later seasons, named after the actor who played the fictional mayor of Quahog and voiced that character until his death in 2017, is where the show maps its most persistent anxieties about the next generation. Meg's experience of high school, as we have discussed, is one of the show's ongoing dark threads. But beyond Meg's story, the school appears across many episodes as an institution that is struggling to do its job in a context that has made that job extremely difficult. The teachers are overwhelmed. The administration is distracted by concerns that have nothing to do with education. The social hierarchies among the students are brutal and entrenched, and the students themselves are navigating all of this without adequate support from the adults around them, whose own problems are substantial enough to leave little bandwidth for their children's struggles. This is not a unique situation. This is, broadly, the reality of a significant portion of American public education at the turn of the millennium and into the years since. And Family Guy, by depicting it with a combination of comedy and underlying seriousness, was participating in a conversation that American culture was having with itself about what we owe the next generation and how well we are actually delivering on that debt. The news station, Quahog 5 News, where Quagmire's ex-girlfriend and various other recurring characters work, is another institution that the show treats with consistent skepticism. The journalism that comes out of Quahog 5 News is sensationalist, poorly researched, agenda-driven, and more concerned with filling airtime than with informing the public. Sound familiar? The show was drawing on real anxieties about the quality and the integrity of local television news, anxieties that were entirely warranted in the late 1990s and that have only grown more warranted in the years since. Quahog, in summary, is a town that the show uses as a kind of pressure chamber. All the anxieties and tensions and failures and small triumphs of American community life get poured into this one fictional place and allowed to interact and combust, and occasionally, surprisingly, produce something warm and recognizable and even hopeful. The town is not just setting, it is argument. It is a sustained case being made, across hundreds of episodes, about what American community life looks like when you look at it without the filter of nostalgia or the distortions of either idealism or cynicism. It looks like the Griffin's neighborhood, messy and alive and full of people who are doing their best, which is sometimes not very much at all, and somehow managing to make something worth living in. Section 10, the cutaway gags as a subconscious mind. Now let us spend some time with the most discussed and most debated formal element of Family Guy. The thing that made it unique. The thing that defined it. The thing that its harshest critics said was a sign of creative bankruptcy and its defenders said was a revolutionary approach to comedic structure. The cutaway gag. If you have watched Family Guy even once, you know how it works. A character says something, usually beginning with "this is even worse than the time I," or "this reminds me of," or sometimes nothing at all because later seasons abandoned even the pretense of a transition, and then the image cuts to a completely unrelated scene that plays out for a few seconds to a couple of minutes and then cuts back. The main story resumes as if the interruption never happened. Critics, most famously Trey Parker and Matt Stone of South Park, argued that this format was a sign that the writing had no structure, no logic, no craft, that the cutaways were random, and that their randomness meant anyone could write them, that they were not jokes so much as non sequiturs pretending to be jokes. Parker and Stone made this argument explicitly in a two-part South Park episode called Cartoon Wars, which depicted Family Guy's writers as a group of manatees randomly selecting balls with words on them and combining those words into cutaways. It was a pointed and funny critique that the Family Guy writers were aware of and that they responded to, in the way that Family Guy usually responds to things, by making jokes about it. But here is what the critics were missing, or at least what they were underweighting. In the first 3 seasons of Family Guy, the cutaways were not random at all. They were specific, carefully calibrated jokes that worked precisely because they were connected to something the speaker had just said. The connection was often absurd, often surreal, but it was a connection. You could trace the logic, even when the logic was dream logic. And dream logic is actually the key to understanding what the cutaway gags were doing, at their best, from the very beginning. The human mind does not move in straight lines. Memory and association and imagination do not follow the laws of linear narrative. When someone says something, your mind does not simply continue in the direction of the sentence. It branches. It reaches sideways into something loosely related, or something from 20 years ago that shares a tone or a feeling or a single word with what was just said, and then it follows that branch for a moment before snapping back to the present. That is what the cutaway gag formalizes. It externalizes the branching associative quality of thought and makes it the structural principle of the comedy. In a well-executed early Family Guy cutaway, you are watching the show's collective consciousness move the way minds actually move, not logically, associatively, impressionistically. The cutaway gags, at their best, were not a replacement for story. They were a different kind of story. The story of how thought works. The story of what we actually experience as we move through time and conversation and memory. There is a parallel here to the tradition of literary stream of consciousness, the technique used by writers like James Joyce and Virginia Woolf and William Faulkner to represent the inner texture of human experience rather than its external sequence. The cutaway gag is stream of consciousness comedy. It is comedy organized around the principles of association rather than causality. And at its best, the effect is not confusion but recognition. You have experienced your own mind doing this. The show is externalizing something you already know. The problem, as the show progressed, was that the cutaways became untethered from this associative logic. They stopped being the show's subconscious and started being the show's filler. The connection between the setup line and the cutaway became thinner and thinner, until in some later episodes it was essentially non-existent. The cutaways were no longer exploring the territory of association. They were just occupying time. This is worth noting, not to criticize but to understand, because the shift from meaningful cutaways to meaningless ones actually mirrors something in the psychological experience of the show's own characters. Early Peter, early Brian, early Lois, they all had inner lives that the cutaways were connected to. The cutaways represented something about the person saying the setup line. They were windows into the unconscious territory of these specific, individual minds. As the characters became flatter, as flanderization took hold and each character was reduced to a smaller set of defining traits, the cutaways became correspondingly emptied of personal specificity. They stopped being anyone's inner life. They became generic. They could have belonged to anyone or no one, and in that emptying, something essential was lost. But the episodes that still work, the episodes from early seasons and the occasional standout later episodes, demonstrate that when the cutaway gag is functioning as designed, it is doing something formally interesting and psychologically honest. It is modeling the experience of a mind that cannot quite stick to its assigned topic, that keeps reaching for associations, that is always partly somewhere else even while it is present in the room. Which is, when you think about it, a reasonably accurate description of how most human minds move through most ordinary moments. The episode Brian and Stewie, which has no cutaways at all, proves the converse argument. When Family Guy strips away the associative structure and forces its characters into sustained linear presence, what emerges is a completely different kind of power. The episode works because it does not allow anyone's mind to wander. It holds the two characters in the vault with nowhere to go and nothing to cut away to, and in that enforced stillness, something surfaces that the constant motion of the standard episode format would have scattered before it could cohere. Both modes of the show are honest, in their way. The cutaway format is honest about the fragmented, associative, slightly ADD quality of modern consciousness. The no-cutaway format is honest about what can happen when you force that fragmented consciousness to slow down and stay. Both kinds of honesty are worth something. The show, at its best, understood when each one was called for. The Conway Twitty gag, where the show simply cut to a full performance of a Conway Twitty song with no transition and no punchline and let it run until it was over, is often cited as the clearest example of the cutaway gag being used purely as time-filling, as creative laziness given form. And it is that. But it is also, in a strange way, the cutaway gag made completely honest about itself. All the other cutaways pretend to be jokes. The Conway Twitty gag drops the pretense. It is just time, just content, just the acknowledgement that something has to go here and this is what we have. It is so brazen in its refusal to try that it circles back around into something almost dada. Almost. Not quite. But almost. Section 11. Religion, Death, and the Afterlife in Family Guy. Let us slow down even further here. Because what Family Guy was doing with religion and death, and the question of what comes after, is one of the most sustained and, in its own way, most serious conversations embedded in the show's 25-year run. Seth MacFarlane is an atheist. He has said so publicly, repeatedly, with the kind of comfortable directness that suggests he made his peace with it a long time ago and does not feel the need to justify or defend it. He uses Brian as the vehicle for this position most explicitly, as Brian is the character who most directly expresses the show's secular worldview, who makes the case for reason over faith, who finds himself frustrated by the persistence of belief in a world he thinks has enough evidence to know better. But here is the more interesting thing. The show does not depict a universe without God. It depicts a universe with God in it, and then asks what that means. And the answer it keeps coming back to is something stranger and more ambiguous, and less comfortable than either believers or skeptics would prefer. God appears in Family Guy repeatedly. He is depicted as a large man, somewhat rumpled, with a beard, capable of performing miracles and also of making extremely bad decisions. He has gone on dates that did not go well. He has used his divine power for petty personal ends. He is, in the show's version, very much a person, which is the show's way of making a particular theological argument. If God is a person, then God is subject to the same limitations and the same failures and the same capacity for self-interest that all persons are subject to. And a God who is subject to those things is not, in any practical sense, the God that most religious traditions are describing. The show's God is best understood not as a theological statement, but as a satirical device for examining how we conceive of authority. The God of Family Guy is the authority figure who is supposed to have all the answers but clearly does not, who is supposed to be perfectly just but often is not, who is supposed to be available to all who seek him but seems, in practice, to have favorites and blind spots and off days. In this, he is not so different from other authority figures the show depicts. From the news anchors who sensationalize rather than inform, to the politicians who govern for personal benefit, to the parents who love their children but cannot always manage to see them clearly. The show is saying, through its treatment of God, something about the gap between the idea of authority and the reality of it. We invent authorities, and we grant them qualities they do not necessarily possess, and we organize our lives around those qualities. And then we are periodically, jarringly reminded that the authorities are as flawed and as limited as the rest of us. The cosmic version of that recognition, which the show stages through its depiction of God, is only a magnification of the same disillusionment that the show depicts in its human institutions. Death is another matter. The character of Death, the Grim Reaper who appears in multiple episodes and is eventually established as having a fairly conventional personal life, complete with emotional difficulties and social awkwardness, is one of the more genuinely philosophical concepts the show developed in its first several seasons. The original plan, never fully realized but visible in the titles of the first several episodes, was to make death a structural presence in every episode. Every story would carry mortality as its undertone. The fact that this plan was not sustained is interesting in itself. The show pulled back from its confrontation with death because the confrontation was proving difficult to sustain within the comedic format. Death kept breaking through the comedy in ways that required the show to either deepen into territory it was not prepared to inhabit fully or to retreat to safer ground. It mostly retreated, but the traces of the original intention remain in the early episodes. In the particular quality of melancholy that runs under the comedy in those first 3 seasons, in the sense that behind all the silliness, something serious is being held. The episode Friends of Peter G., where Peter and Brian are forced to attend Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and eventually confronted with a vision of what their lives would look like if they continued on their current paths, is one of the show's most sustained engagements with mortality and with the choices that run parallel to it. Death shows Peter 2 possible futures, one in which he continues drinking without restraint and one in which he never drank at all. Neither future is entirely positive. The show is not making a simple argument about sobriety or indulgence. It is making a more complicated argument about how the same person, making different choices, ends up in different configurations of joy and loss, none of which is purely one or the other. That complexity is what distinguishes Family Guy's better engagements with death from its simpler ones. The simpler ones treat death as a punchline, which it sometimes is. The more honest ones acknowledge that death is the thing that gives the other things their weight. That Peter's relationship with Lois matters partly because it is finite, that Brian's unfinished novel haunts him partly because time is running out, that Meg's suffering is genuinely suffering, and not just comedy, partly because her years of being treated as invisible are years she will not get back. The afterlife in Family Guy, glimpsed occasionally through various plot devices, is depicted as a continuation of sorts, a place where the same personality traits and the same unresolved tensions follow you. Heaven is real in the show's universe, but it is not a resolution, it is a location. The characters who end up there, at least temporarily, bring themselves with them. Their problems do not evaporate. Their longing does not become satisfaction. They are simply in a different setting, still being themselves, which is both the most comforting and the most disturbing version of immortality possible. Brian's death in Season 12, and his subsequent revival, is the most emotionally significant engagement with mortality the show produced in its later years. The death itself was played with unusual sincerity. The grief of the characters around Brian, Stewie's devastation in particular, was real. The show was asking its audience to sit with a loss that mattered, not because Brian was perfect, but because the bonds formed over years of shared life are not easily replaced. The revival, 2 episodes later, undid this with a speed that felt like a betrayal to many viewers. And the undo was a betrayal, in a sense. The show was not willing to live in the grief it had created. It brought Brian back because the alternative was too permanent, too costly, too close to the actual experience of loss rather than the comedic version of it. But even in that backing away, the show revealed something. It revealed how close to the surface the real feelings were. For the characters, and perhaps for the writers, and certainly for the audience. The outpouring of grief and anger when Brian died was not about a cartoon dog. It was about what Brian represented. The show had made him into something real enough that his absence created a real absence, and the response to that was too large and too sincere to dismiss. Family Guy kept returning to these themes of religion and death and meaning, not because it had clear answers to offer, but because the questions are unavoidable if you are honest about what it means to be alive in a finite body in an uncertain universe. The show was, beneath all the irreverence, wrestling with the same questions that every serious piece of human creative work wrestles with eventually. What are we doing here? What happens when we leave? Whether any of it means anything. And if it does not mean anything by itself, whether meaning is something we are allowed to make? The answer the show kept arriving at in its best moments was yes. Meaning is something we are allowed to make. Out of flawed families and imperfect friendships and uncompleted work and unrealized ambitions and long evenings in bars that are not very glamorous. The meaning is not given. It is assembled piece by piece out of whatever is available. And what the Griffins have available is each other, imperfect and frequently maddening, and occasionally genuinely wonderful. And that, in the show's deepest moments of honesty, is enough. Section 12. What Family Guy was really saying all along. The unified hidden message. We have come a long way from the premiere in January of 1999, From that first episode that aired after the Super Bowl to 22 million people who had no idea what they were getting into. And now, having traced all of these threads through characters and themes and formal choices and the specific textures of time and place that the show inhabited, it is worth trying to bring them together. Because there is a unified message in Family Guy, or at least a unified sensibility, that runs underneath everything else. It is not always the message the show was consciously trying to send. It is sometimes the message that emerged despite the show's intentions, the thing that accumulated across seasons and contradicted the stated comedy and refused to stay buried under the shock value and the cutaway gags. The message is this: being ordinary is not a failure. That sounds simple, but in a culture that is organized, at almost every level, around the idea that ordinary is insufficient, that you should always be more, do more, become more, that the measure of a life is its exceptionalism, that simple is settling, and simple is giving up, and simple is the thing that happens to people who did not try hard enough. This is actually a fairly radical claim to keep making in a primetime animated comedy for 25 years. Peter Griffin is not exceptional. He is not going to become exceptional. He is a man who works at a brewery and drinks beer at a bar and loves his family in the imperfect way available to him. And the show, in its bones, refuses to treat that as sad. It treats it as the whole thing, as the entire texture of a life, as something worth watching, worth laughing at, worth caring about. Brian Griffin is exceptional in aspiration and ordinary in execution. His unfinished novel is not a tragedy so much as it is a portrait of how most ambition actually resolves in real life, not with the grand publication and the recognition and the sense of completion, but with the ongoing daily choice to keep caring about the thing even when the thing is not getting done. The novel exists. It is alive in his imagination. It matters to him. And the show argues, quietly, that mattering to him is enough for it to be real. Meg Griffin is extraordinary in her ordinariness. In a household of outsized personalities, she is the human scale one. She wants what most people want. She wants to be seen. And the show's most honest moments acknowledge that being seen is not a small want. It is perhaps the primary human want. To have your actual self known to another person is one of the most fundamental things we pursue, and Meg's pursuit of it, in the teeth of a family that consistently fails to provide it, is not pathetic. It is brave. Stewie Griffin builds his elaborate theater of power and genius because he wants what Meg wants, which is the same thing that everyone in the Griffin household wants in their own way. He wants to be seen. He wants the person who is supposed to love him to actually know him. The weapons and the schemes are not the story. They are the distraction from the story. The story is a baby in a high chair who has built an entire inner civilization because the outer one has not yet made space for him. Lois Griffin is trying to hold everything together while being a complete person, which is not a small thing to try to do. The two projects work against each other constantly. The holding together requires self-suppression, requires managing, requires putting your own needs in the service of everyone else's. Being a complete person requires the opposite. The tension between those two projects, which is not unique to Lois but is perhaps most visible in her, is one of the enduring complications of adult life, and the show never resolves it because it cannot be resolved. You just keep living inside it and trying to find the moments when both things are possible simultaneously. The friends at the Drunken Clam love each other, not efficiently, not in ways that would be recognized by any formal theory of emotional health. But they love each other in the way that men who have been socialized to find love difficult manage to love, through proximity and consistency, and the low-grade companionship of showing up at the same place at the same time over and over again for years. That love is real. The show knows it is real. And it treats it with a respect that is sometimes almost invisible, because the surrounding comedy is so loud. The town of Quahog is a place where ordinary life happens, where institutions fail and people make bad decisions and the news is not very good most of the time, and the school is struggling and the church is more about community than theology, and the bar is where the actual honest conversation takes place. It is America. Not ideal America. Not the promise of America, but the actual America that exists in working-class neighborhoods in every state, where people are doing their best with limited resources and imperfect information, and complicated relationships and genuine love for the places and people they have built their lives around. And the cutaway gags, at their best, are the mind of that America, restless and associative and unable to stay on one thing for very long, reaching constantly for connection between disparate things, finding humor in the gaps between what we say and what we mean, between what we intend and what we do, between who we tell ourselves we are and who we actually are when nobody is performing for anybody. Family Guy is a show about the gap. All the comedy lives in the gap, and the gap is not empty. The gap is full of everything that is most human about us, our pretension and our failure to live up to it, our love and our inability to say it clearly, our need for community and our trouble building it, our confrontation with mortality and our profound difficulty accepting it, our desire to be seen and our terror at being seen fully. The show was not always wise. It was not always kind. It made choices over its long run that it should probably not have made, and it made those choices with a breezy disregard for consequence that is itself a form of honesty about how creative institutions behave when they are large and commercially successful and no longer being questioned hard enough from the inside. But in the spaces between the bad choices and the lazy seasons and the cutaways that had no purpose, there was always something else. Something that connected with audiences not because it was sophisticated or prestigious or crafted with care, but because it was, at its most honest, recognizable. You saw your own house in the Griffin house, your own father in Peter, or your own fear of becoming Peter, your own ambition in Brian's unfinished novel, your own teenage invisibility in Meg, your own capacity for elaborate self-protection in Stewie, your own bar, your own friends, your own complicated marriage, your own town that is imperfect and yours. That recognition is the real hidden message of Family Guy, not a political argument, not a theological position, not a sophisticated cultural critique, though the show gestured at all of those things at various times. The real message, embedded in every episode whether the writers intended it or not, is that ordinary life, with all its failures and its comedy and its unexpected warmth, is worth watching, is worth laughing at, is worth caring about. The Griffins are not great people doing great things. They are small people doing small things in a world that mostly does not notice them. And in that smallness, watched with enough attention and enough honesty and enough love, there is everything. There is the whole human story, compressed into a Rhode Island suburb, played out in cartoon form, full of cutaway gags and chicken fights and unfinished novels, and an evil baby who just wants his mother to really see him. That is Family Guy. Beneath everything else, that is what it was always saying. And so, quietly, that is where we leave the Griffin family tonight. Still in their house in Quahog, still making their particular kind of chaotic love work, still full of things they cannot say to each other, still full of things that do not need to be said because 20-something years of proximity have made them understood anyway. If you have been drifting through this and letting it wash over you, I hope it gave you something comfortable to float on for a while. And if you caught threads of it as you went, I hope some of those threads are ones worth holding on to. This has been a long night of looking at a show that looked, for a long time, like it was not looking back. It was looking back. It was always looking back. If this kind of deep, slow, atmospheric exploration is something you want more of, please subscribe. It takes almost no effort on your part, and it means everything for what we are building here. And leave a comment if you feel like it. Tell me what time it is where you are. Tell me what it looks like outside your window. Those comments are some of the best parts of making these videos, knowing where in the world people are when words find them. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Rest well. End of script. Section 2, Extended the Specific Architecture of Working Class Anxiety. Let's return to the Griffin household and spend more time in it, because there is more to say about the specific architecture of the anxiety the show was mapping. Not the broad strokes of class and aspiration that we touched on before, but the granular, daily texture of what it feels like to be a person in that position. The person who is, by most external measures, fine, and who knows on some inarticulate level that fine is not the same as good. Peter Griffin works at the Pawtucket Brewery in the show's primary timeline. He has worked there for many of the show's seasons, as a safety inspector, as a spokesperson at various points, and in various other capacities that the plot required. The brewery is not glamorous work. It is industrial and regulated and hierarchical in the way that workplaces are hierarchical when the people who work in them have no particular ownership of what they produce. Peter shows up, does his job, receives his paycheck, and leaves. The work does not follow him home in his thoughts. It does not generate pride or ambition or the sense that he is building towards something. It generates money, which is what he needs it to do. This relationship to work, the purely instrumental one, is not unique to Peter Griffin. It is the primary relationship that most American workers have with most of their employment, and it is a relationship that the broader culture refuses to name honestly because the official story is that work is meaningful and fulfilling, and the engine of personal development. The official story is that you should be finding your passion and doing that for a living. The reality, for the majority of people, is that the work is what it is, and the meaning has to come from somewhere else. For Peter, it comes from the bar, from his friends, from Lois, from the television shows he loves and the movies from the 1970s and 1980s that he references constantly, from the ridiculous schemes and obsessions that the show uses as its primary plot engines. These are not lesser sources of meaning. They are the actual sources of meaning available to a man in Peter's position, and the show, in its most thoughtful moments, treats them as such. The obsession episodes deserve particular attention in this context. Family Guy frequently uses the structure of Peter becoming completely consumed by some new interest or identity. He becomes obsessed with a band, with a movie, with a cause, with a craft, with a historical period, with a sport. The obsessions are always played as comedy because the comedy is in the extreme nature of the commitment, the way Peter goes from zero to complete dedication in the span of a scene. But the frequency of the obsessions tells a story of its own. A person who becomes obsessively interested in one new thing after another is a person who is looking for something that the available options have not provided, not in a tragic or dramatic way, just in the human way. The search for meaning through external investment is extremely common, particularly among people whose work does not supply it. You find the thing that gives you a sense of purpose and competence and forward motion. You stay with it until it no longer provides those things. You find the next thing. The show presents this as a character flaw, as Peter's immaturity and his inability to maintain interest. But it is also, read differently, a portrait of a very ordinary human hunger. The Griffins also, across their history on the show, reflect something about the specific American relationship to money and to the anxiety of almost but not quite enough. There are episodes where the family is in financial crisis, where the house is in danger, where Peter has made a financial decision so catastrophically poor that the material foundation of their lives is threatened. These episodes are played as comedy, and they are funny. But they are funny in the specific way that only things that are also terrifying can be funny. The laughter is the recognition laughter of an audience that has, many of them, felt the cold touch of financial uncertainty and found that the only available response in the moment was something that looked like amusement. The episode where Peter briefly becomes very wealthy, inheriting money or stumbling into some form of sudden financial elevation, almost always resolves with the money going away and the family returning to their previous economic position. The show does not ultimately believe in upward mobility for the Griffins. They exist in a bracket and they stay in it. And the constancy of the position, were comedically dramatized, reflects something about the lived experience of economic stagnation that a significant portion of the American audience would have recognized as their own. Rhode Island itself, as a setting, carries specific economic resonances that the show does not always spell out but that inform the texture of the world. Rhode Island's manufacturing economy declined significantly in the decades before and during the show's run. The mills and the factories that had employed the working class of New England for generations were either gone or going. The replacement industries, financial services, education, healthcare, were not equally available to the same populations. The transition, if it could even be called that, was uneven and often painful, and the people who got left behind in it were precisely the kind of people that Peter Griffin represents. The Drunken Clam, as a physical space, is the most honest location in Quahog. It is not trying to be anything other than what it is. It has no aspirations. It does not market itself as a craft beer destination or a gastropub or an experience. It is a bar. It has beer on tap and stools at the counter, and tables that have accumulated years of rings from wet glasses. It is slightly worn and slightly dark and completely comfortable in the way that spaces become comfortable through sheer accumulated familiarity. This is the kind of bar that American cities and towns have been losing steadily for decades, as the generic chain restaurants replaced the local establishments that knew their regulars by name and kept their regular order in memory. Family Guy, almost despite itself, was making an argument for the value of these places and the loss that comes from their disappearance. The Drunken Clam works not because it is a good bar in any commercial sense, but because it is their bar. It is the place that belongs to the four of them in a way that no other place quite does. And when it is threatened, as it occasionally is across the series run, the response from the characters is not rational economic calculation. It is grief. The loss of the bar would be the loss of the place where they are most themselves, and that is not replaceable. The show was also, through the Griffin family's relationship to their house and their neighborhood, making observations about the meaning of place in working-class American life. The Griffins do not rent. They own, or at least they are ostensibly making payments on a mortgage that will eventually result in ownership. And this ownership, even when the house is falling apart around them and the mortgage payments are a stretch, is significant. The house represents stability, permanence, the material proof of a life that is rooted somewhere and not just passing through. This relationship to place, the deep attachment to a specific location that working-class families often have in ways that more mobile, more affluent families tend not to have, is something the show captures accurately even when it is not being explicit about it. Peter and Lois did not move to Quahog as part of a lifestyle choice. They are there because it is where they are from, where their people are, where the specific connections and familiarity and community that sustains them has been built over years of being present. Moving would be possible in theory, but it would cost them everything that makes the move unnecessary. Section 3. Extended Peter Griffin and the architecture of a man who was not seen. We said Peter Griffin was tragedy beneath comedy, and we explored the bones of that tragedy. Let us flesh it out further, because the specifics matter, and because the specifics are where the show was doing its most interesting work. The episode Where's Stewie? From the show's later seasons returns briefly to Francis Griffin, Peter's stepfather, now deceased, and the show handles the memory of him with something that looks like, but probably is not quite, grief. Francis was a man who believed in a set of rules that predated the world Peter grew up in. Rules about what men were supposed to be and how families were supposed to work and what constituted a respectable life. He applied those rules to Peter with a consistency that had no flexibility for who Peter actually was. This is one of the more recognizable forms of parental damage, the kind inflicted not through overt cruelty but through the insistence on a standard that the child cannot meet and was never consulted about. Peter did not get to negotiate his father's expectations of him. He received them as commands. And the commands were ones he consistently failed to fulfill, not because he was incapable, but because the standards were designed for a different kind of son than Peter was. The specific texture of Francis's criticism is important. He questioned Peter's intelligence. He questioned his ambition. He questioned his ability to provide for a family, his fitness as a husband, his usefulness as a person. These are the deepest possible cuts because they target the foundations. Intelligence and ambition, and the capacity to provide, are the cornerstones of the specific version of masculine identity that the culture of Francis's generation constructed. To tell a man he fails in those areas is to tell him he is not a man. Peter absorbed this message, at least partially, not in the sense of accepting it as true, because Peter's self-concept is not primarily one of failure, but in the sense that the message left a residue of anxious searching that shapes his behavior. He is always testing himself against some external standard. He is always reaching for validation from outside. He is always looking for the signal that he is okay, that he measures up, that the verdict his stepfather delivered was wrong. This is why the Peter of the early seasons is, despite his foolishness, an essentially sympathetic character. His impulsiveness and his bad decisions are the behaviors of a man trying too hard, not of a man who does not care. He is not thoughtless. He is thinking about the wrong things because the things he was taught to think about were the wrong ones. The measure he is applying to himself is someone else's measure, and it does not fit him. And the constant friction of that ill-fitting measure is what generates both the comedy and the quiet sadness underneath it. The episode Petarded, in which Peter discovers he qualifies as mentally handicapped after a Family Feud test reveals his IQ is below a certain threshold, is one of the show's most interesting engagements with the question of what intelligence is and what it means. Peter initially celebrates the diagnosis because it comes with certain protections, certain advantages, certain ways that the world has to accommodate him that it did not before. He weaponizes it in comic fashion. But underneath the comedy is the show noticing something real, that the way intelligence is measured and the way it manifests in actual human lives are often two completely different things. Peter's intelligence is not measurable by the instruments that produce IQ scores. That does not mean he does not have it. It means it is the wrong instrument for the person. Peter understands things about people. He reads social situations in ways that his cognitive test scores would not predict. He has a kind of cunning, impulsive and self-interested and often counterproductive, but genuine, that the standard definitions of intelligence do not account for. The episode is a joke about Peter's stupidity. It is also, read another way, a joke about the poverty of our measures. The show also explored across multiple episodes the specific texture of Peter's relationship to his Irish Catholic heritage. He is half Irish and deeply identified with that heritage, using it as one of the available explanations for various aspects of his character: the drinking, the stubbornness, the particular flavor of sentimentality that surfaces occasionally beneath the bluster. The Irish-American working-class community that Peter comes from has its own specific relationship to aspiration and failure, its own set of stories about men who worked hard and drank hard and loved their families in loud and impractical ways, and Peter fits into those stories with a comfort that suggests the fit is genuine rather than performed. His Catholicism, nominal and imperfect, and frequently contradicted by his actual behavior, is another aspect of his heritage that the show treats with complicated honesty. Peter attends church. He prays when he is in trouble. He has the cultural scaffolding of a religious worldview without clearly having engaged very deeply with what that worldview actually requires of him. This is extremely common. The cultural Catholic who holds on to the rituals and the identity without necessarily living inside the theology is a real and recognizable human type, and Peter's version of that type is both funny and honest about its own contradictions. The evolution of Peter's cruelty across the seasons is worth tracing carefully, because it represents one of the show's most significant choices, whether or not the show made it consciously. The early Peter's worst impulses were towards self-sabotage. He hurt himself through impulsiveness. He hurt his family through thoughtlessness rather than intention. The harm he caused was the collateral damage of someone who did not think things through. By the middle seasons, this began to shift. The selfishness became more conscious. The cruelty became more targeted. Peter began to do things that were not just thoughtless, but actually mean, directed at specific people, for reasons that were personal and small. The show did not always seem aware of this shift. The comedy continued in the same register even as the underlying character was becoming someone different. And this is where the tragedy of Peter's Flanderization, to use the technical term, is sharpest. Not that he was made worse, but that the worsening happened without acknowledgement, without the show registering that the character had crossed a line that changed the meaning of his actions. The lovable fool who hurt people accidentally is a comic character. The mean man who hurts people deliberately is something else. Family Guy turned Peter into the second thing, while continuing to present him as the first. The most honest episode about what Peter had become is the Seahorse Seashell Party episode, when Meg reads back his behavior to him in the clearest possible terms. She is not exaggerating. Every specific thing she accuses him of is something the show has depicted. The farting in her face, the sheer volume of dismissal, the specific texture of being a father who finds his daughter's existence inconvenient. He laughs. The early Peter would not have laughed. He would have felt something. The fact that he laughs is the show, perhaps without meaning to, telling you exactly how far the character has traveled from his origins. Section 4. Extended Brian and the specific grief of almost. We need to go deeper with Brian, because the surface reading of his character, the pretentious dog who thinks too much of himself, misses what the show was actually trying to do with him at its most intentional. Brian's mother abandoned him when he was a puppy. She left him at a young age, and he was picked up by Peter as a stray, which is how he ended up in the Griffin household. The abandonment is mentioned across several episodes and is used to explain, at least partially, the cocaine addiction that Brian overcame at some point before the show's timeline begins. More than explaining the addiction, the abandonment explains the shape of his romantic life and his social life, and his relationship to commitment of any kind. A person who was abandoned by their first attachment figure tends, without intervention, to organize their subsequent relationships around the expectation of abandonment. They reach for connection and then create conditions that make connection difficult to sustain. They push people away before the people can leave on their own terms. They prefer the ones who are unavailable, because the unavailability protects them from the real risk of losing something they actually have. The abandonment wound runs underneath everything Brian does in his adult life, and the show, when it is paying attention to him, makes this visible. His pursuit of women who are wrong for him in various ways is the clearest expression of this pattern. He falls for Lois, who is married and unavailable. He pursues relationships with women who are emotionally unavailable, for reasons that are not always obvious to him. He is drawn to the ones who will not or cannot fully commit, because a commitment that cannot be made cannot be broken. The emotional safety of the unavailable relationship is that it never has to be tested by reality. The one relationship where Brian actually risks full commitment, the relationship with Stewie, is also the one relationship that actually works. And this is not accidental. Stewie is, by definition, not going to leave. He is a baby. He is Brian's charge. The relationship has structure built into it that does not depend on Stewie choosing Brian. Stewie cannot choose otherwise. And within that forced continuity, something real has grown up. The commitment that Brian could not make on his own terms he found himself making by accident, and what grew out of it was the most genuine relationship in his life. The novel is worth more time. Faster Than the Speed of Love. A title that sounds like a romance novel, which is appropriate for a character who thinks of himself as a romantic, but whose romanticism is really an aesthetic preference rather than an emotional capacity. The speed of love is presumably very fast, and the title promises something that exceeds even that speed. Whether the novel would fulfill that promise, we cannot know, because it does not exist. It exists only as a title and a promise and a running joke. This is, again, the most honest thing about it. Many ambitious creative projects exist exactly this way, as a title and a promise and a running joke in the mind of the person who carries them around, without making them real. The Season 9 episode Brian Writes a Bestseller is the show's most explicit and most devastating engagement with Brian's creative life. Stewie encourages Brian to try something different after the novel's continued non-completion. Brian writes a self-help book, a genre he would normally consider beneath him, and it becomes a massive bestseller. This is the moment the show was building toward with Brian's character for years. The moment of actual, measurable success. The moment when the external world validates something Brian has made. And Brian responds by becoming a monster. Arrogant, dismissive, cruel to the person who encouraged him. He treats Stewie, the one who believed in him, with contempt. He loses himself in the success in the same way he usually loses himself in failure, completely and without awareness of what he is doing. The episode is the show's argument that Brian's problem was never about whether he was capable. It was about who he was inside the capability. The success revealed that the person underneath the aspiration was not the person the aspiration had implied. This is a painful truth that the show tells more directly than it usually allows itself to. Success does not fix the underlying problem. Getting what you wanted does not make you the person you imagined you would be when you got it. The gap between aspiration and self, which Brian had always blamed on his failure to achieve, turns out to persist through the achievement. The gap is not about the achievement. The gap is about something else, something internal, something that no amount of external validation can close. Brian's relationship with Quagmire is another dimension worth exploring. Quagmire hates Brian. He has hated him with a consistency and a specificity that the show eventually addressed directly in the episode Jerome is the New Black, where Quagmire delivers a speech that catalogs exactly why. The speech is accurate. Every specific complaint Quagmire makes about Brian is backed by something the show has depicted. Brian hits on Lois in front of Peter. Brian's intellectual pretension is not backed by intellectual output. Brian's atheism is performative rather than arrived at through careful thought. Brian is a bad father to his biological son Dylan. The speech is devastating, and it is devastating because it is true. But here is the interesting thing about Quagmire's speech. It is delivered by a character who is, by any objective standard, not a moral authority. Quagmire sleeps with his friends' wives. He pursues women with methods that range from ethically dubious to something considerably worse. He has his own gallery of failures and hypocrisies that are at least as large as Brian's. The fact that the show chose Quagmire to deliver this specific speech is not an accident. It is a statement that truth-telling does not require moral purity in the teller. Quagmire can see Brian's failures clearly precisely because he is too concerned with his own life to maintain the kind of self-protective filter that someone with more invested in appearing good might have. And Brian cannot argue with the speech, not because he is speechless with shock, but because the accusations are accurate. He can identify the hypocrisy of the source. He can point out that Quagmire is in no position to lecture anyone about ethics. But he cannot dispute the content. The content is true, and the truth just sits there after the speech ends, neither resolved nor properly engaged with, because the show is honest enough to put it in and then moves on, rather than following through on what its honesty implies. Section 5. Extended Stewie and the architecture of a self built without witnesses. Let us go deeper into the specific architecture of Stewie Griffin's psychology, because the show built this character with more care than it usually gets credit for, and the details matter. The mechanics of Stewie's intelligence are never quite explained. The show implies, across various episodes, that his genius is either genetic, inherited from some part of his lineage that the show gestures toward without committing to, or the result of some kind of accelerated development that is simply a fact of his existence. Not explainable, just true. What is clear is that the intelligence arrived fully formed, without any developmental process that the audience is shown. Stewie has always been this way. He has always spoken like this, thought like this, planned like this. This creates an interesting situation. His intelligence has no origin story within the show's universe. It is simply the condition of his existence. And so is the gap between that intelligence and his actual capabilities. The fact of being in a baby's body, subject to a baby's physical limitations, dependent on adults for every material need, unable to act on most of his own intentions without the cooperation of a world that cannot hear him speak. The gap between capacity and circumstance is one of the most universal human experiences, and Stewie's version of it is scaled to an extreme that makes it legible in a way that subtler versions often are not. Everyone has experienced at some point the frustration of knowing what needs to be done and being unable to do it because of circumstances outside their control. The gap between what you understand and what you can change. The gap between your perception of a situation and your power to act within it. Stewie's version of this is that he can perceive everything and change almost nothing. He can see that Lois is inadequate to the task of actually knowing him. He cannot make her adequate. He can see that the family is dysfunctional in specific and traceable ways. He cannot fix the dysfunction. He can design weapons and time machines and mind control devices. He cannot deploy them with any real effect because the world treats him as a baby and therefore does not take any of it seriously. The result of this gap, sustained from infancy, is the particular kind of person Stewie becomes. Someone who has developed an extraordinary inner life because the outer world has offered so little adequate to engage with. The schemes are not just schemes, they are creative work. They are the expression of a mind that has found the only available outlet for its capacities. And when those schemes are foiled, the frustration is not just the frustration of failure, it is the frustration of creative work unrecognized. The British accent, which we touched on earlier, is worth more examination because it is connected to a specific cultural tradition that Stewie is drawing from. The villains and heroes of mid-20th century British theatrical tradition. The people who speak in the cadences that Stewie's voice models were often people of extreme capacity who existed in a world that could not fully contain them. The grandeur of the accent is the grandeur of someone who has decided that the ordinary world's categories do not apply to them, who has, through sheer force of self-presentation, claimed a different jurisdiction. Stewie did this very early. He decided, on some level, that the show does not make fully explicit that if he could not be a person in the way the people around him were people, recognized and spoken to and taken seriously, he would be a different kind of being entirely. One that operated by its own rules. One that did not require the acknowledgement of people who could not understand him anyway. The episodes where Stewie's armor drops, even partially, are the most emotionally demanding things the show does with him. Not the villain episodes, not the world domination schemes, but the episodes where the performance fails and what is underneath it becomes briefly visible. The episode where Stewie's teddy bear Rupert is destroyed and the grief is outsized and real. The therapy episode where the accent goes and the real voice comes out. The various moments across the seasons where Stewie looks at Brian and something passes between them that neither of them quite names but that is unmistakably love, the specific love of people who have found each other in the condition of mutual misunderstanding with the rest of the world. The trajectory of Stewie from Season 1 to Season 25 is the trajectory of someone slowly, reluctantly, painfully learning to lower his defenses. Not completely, not without reversal. The armor goes back on regularly. But across the whole arc there is movement. From the completely sealed, self-sufficient villain who needed nothing from anyone, to the character who is capable of genuine vulnerability, genuine fear, genuine love. The movement is not dramatic. It is not clean, but it is real, and the show, when it is being honest about Stewie, keeps it in view. Section 6. Extended Meg and the specific texture of being designated. We need to spend more time with Meg because her story is both the most uncomfortable and the most socially relevant thing in the show's archive, and the discomfort deserves to be sat with rather than moved past. The experience of being the designated recipient of a group's displaced contempt is something that can happen in any social unit. It happens in families, as it does with Meg. It happens in workplaces, in friend groups, in classrooms, in sports teams. Anywhere that a collection of people share space and develop social hierarchies and need somewhere to put the things they cannot deal with directly. The person who ends up in that position does not choose it. They are put there by a social process that has nothing to do with their actual qualities. What makes this process most insidious is that the contempt, once established, becomes self-reinforcing. The person in the designated role behaves differently because of the contempt they have received. The altered behavior, which is a response to mistreatment rather than its cause, gets read as evidence that the mistreatment was deserved. The target becomes less confident, more defensive, more socially awkward, less able to project the ease and authority that would make people take them seriously. These changes are then cited as the reason for the contempt, rather than its result. Meg, as the show depicts her in its best episodes, is actually one of the most morally serious characters in Family Guy. She has a genuine ethical compass. She cares about right and wrong in ways that the rest of her family demonstrably does not. She shows compassion for people who are struggling. She is the character who, when an actual crisis occurs that requires actual care, often shows up most authentically. The episode where Neil Goldman, the boy who has had a crush on her for years, is in genuine danger, and Meg's response to him is genuinely compassionate. These moments are spread through the show's run, and they consistently demonstrate that the real Meg, the Meg who is not being defined by what other people have made her, is someone worth knowing. The Seahorse Seashell Party speech, which we have discussed, is the show's fullest acknowledgement of this. Meg knows what the family dynamic is. She understands it in precisely the terms that a family systems therapist would use. She is not confused about what has been done to her or why. She is simply powerless within the system to change it without cost. And the cost the show assigns to change, which is the collapse of the family's functional coherence, is presented as too high a price to pay. This is where the show's hidden message about Meg becomes most complicated, because the message it appears to be sending, that victims of family dysfunction should accept their role for the good of the system, is clearly wrong. It is harmful. It is not what healthy people or healthy families do, but the show is also simultaneously depicting something that is genuinely true about how these systems work, which is that they do resist change. That the identified patient who tries to stop being the identified patient often faces enormous pressure, both internal and external, to return to the role. That the cost of leaving the role can feel genuinely prohibitive. The show is not endorsing this situation, it is describing it. The difference matters. Family Guy is not saying Meg should accept the abuse because it serves the family. It is depicting, with uncomfortable accuracy, the experience of someone who has been shaped by a system that benefits from her acceptance of the role and who has not yet found the resources to exit it. The fact that the comedy does not always acknowledge the darkness of what it is depicting does not mean the darkness is not there. It means the show is being honest about something it lacks the courage or the format to fully confront. Mila Kunis's performance across all the seasons of the show, all done in a recording booth away from the visual characters she is voicing, builds a Meg who is much more than the surface reading suggests. The specific quality of resignation in Meg's voice in certain episodes, the way she processes her family's treatment of her without quite letting the hurt land fully, is a careful and specific performance choice. Kunis is playing someone who has developed, as a survival mechanism, the ability to take the hit and continue moving. It is not numbness. It is a trained response, learned through repetition. The hit comes, and Meg absorbs it and keeps going. The show knows that she is doing this. Kunis knows she is doing this. The tragedy is that the character herself sometimes forgets why she developed the skill. Section 7. Extended Lois and the Mathematics of Sacrifice. Let us return to Lois and push past the surface reading that we started with. Because Lois Griffin is carrying something that the show took years to fully articulate, and what she is carrying is among the most universal experiences in the show's entire emotional universe. Lois married Peter. She chose him. She continues to choose him, every day, across every season. The choosing is a daily fact rather than a single historic decision. And the mathematics of that choosing, what it costs and what it provides, and what it looks like across decades, is what the show is really interested in when it takes Lois seriously. The cost side of the ledger is visible in specific episodes, but also in the accumulation of her characterization across seasons. She teaches piano to children because it is a skill she has, and it generates some modest income, and it connects her to the music that was central to her early formation. But the piano teaching is not what she became. It is what remained available to her in the configuration of life she chose. She has not toured, she has not composed. She has not pursued the kind of musical engagement that her talent might have warranted if she had organized her life around it. This is not a complaint about Peter, it is a fact about choices. When you choose a life, you unchoose the alternatives. Lois chose a life that did not have space for the kind of sustained artistic development that music at a serious level requires. She knew this when she made the choice, and she made it anyway. What she did not know, perhaps, was how the not having would feel across years of having committed to the alternative. The kleptomania surfaces when something in her is registering the imbalance. The stealing is not about the objects she steals, it is about the taking, about the assertion of a self that exists outside the relational configuration she inhabits. She is a wife and a mother. She is the one who maintains and provides and manages and sustains. The stealing says, I am also something else. I am a self that wants things that are not for anyone but me. The things themselves are irrelevant. The wanting is the point. Her relationship with her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, is one of the show's most persistently interesting dynamics. Carter is everything that Peter is not. Wealthy, socially prominent, emotionally withholding, contemptuous of Peter in specific and sometimes creative ways. He did not want his daughter to marry Peter. He was wrong, and the show does not let him be unambiguously right, but he is also, from within his own framework, consistent. He married within his class. He expected his daughter to do the same. He does not understand her choice, and has not, across all the years of his relationship with his son-in-law, arrived at understanding. What is interesting is that Lois has not required his understanding. She made her choice without it and has maintained it without it. This is, in its own way, one of the strongest things about her characterization. She does not need her father's approval. She was shaped by the household he created, yes. She carries the habits and the aesthetic sensibilities and the social skills of the class she was raised in, but she does not defer to it. She is her own person in a way that Carter, for all his power, cannot quite override. The episode where Lois becomes a model, briefly, and is drawn into a world that resembles the one she came from, is the show's clearest statement about what she gave up and whether she regrets it. She is good at it. She is comfortable in it. The clothes and the parties and the attention and the social milieu are all things she knows how to navigate, but she comes back. Not because the other world rejected her, but because she rejected it deliberately, again. The choice she made the first time holds. Not because it was easy, but because it was hers. Lois is also, and this needs to be said, funny. She is one of the show's most reliable comic presences, and Alex Borstein's voice performance gives her a specific comedic texture, dry and warm and occasionally sharp, that is distinct from any other character in the show. The comedy in Lois's scenes usually comes from her serving as the grounded observer of the chaos around her, the person whose reactions to the Griffin household's disasters are recognizable as the reactions any sane person would have. But the comedy is not just reactive. Lois has her own considerable capacity for mischief, for risk-taking, for the kind of behavior that contradicts her surface presentation and reveals the complexity underneath. Section 8. Extended the friends and what they are really saying about each other. The drunken clam scenes deserve one more round of attention, because the show was doing something consistently interesting in those scenes that is easy to miss because the individual jokes are so prominent. Watch the four of them together, across many episodes, not what they are saying, how they are arranged, what their physical presence in relation to each other communicates. They sit at the same table, they sit in roughly the same positions every time. There is a comfort in the arrangement that comes from repetition, from the many times they have occupied those same seats before. The arrangement itself is a statement. We have been here before. We will be here again. This is where we are. The conversations they have are not, mostly, consequential. They argue about sports. They react to whatever Peter has done lately. They navigate whatever crisis is currently afflicting the neighborhood. They occasionally share something personal, usually in the heavily coded way that men trained to avoid direct emotional expression tend to share personal things, through jokes, through complaint, through the third-person reference that keeps the feeling at arm's length while still allowing it to be present. But the conversations, however inconsequential in content, are tremendously consequential in function. They are the regular practice of being known by people who have known you for a long time. They are the maintenance of a social bond that, if not regularly exercised, would atrophy and disappear. They are the drunken clams version of what people do when they say that the most important thing is just showing up. Joe's story across the series is worth a more careful look in this context. He was introduced as someone the others admired. Over time, he became someone the others felt comfortable dismissing. This shift is not random. It tracks something that happens in real male friendships when one member of a group experiences a significant change in status, whether that change is a job loss, or a divorce, or a disability, or any of the other things that can move someone from a position of relative strength to a position of relative vulnerability. The group often does not know how to handle the vulnerability. The solidarity that existed when everyone was more or less okay falters when someone is actually struggling. The jokes that used to be lighthearted become sharper. The ribbing that was playful becomes something with more edge. Not because the friendship has disappeared, but because the friendship has not developed the tools to acknowledge what is actually happening. The friends default to the only mode they have, which is the joking mode, and the joking mode is not adequate to the situation. This is a failure that the show depicts accurately and without fully acknowledging that it is depicting it. The treatment of Joe in later seasons is presented as comedy, as the natural extension of the group dynamic. It is also, if you look at it directly, a portrait of how male friendships fail the people inside them when the going actually gets hard. Cleveland's departure and return bracket this observation with a kind of structural honesty. When Cleveland goes, the group continues. When he returns, the group reforms. The continuity is in the table and the bar and the habit, not in any particular member. Anyone can be absent and the thing persists. Anyone can return and the thing absorbs them back. This is both the strength and the limitation of this kind of friendship. Its durability is built on something more abstract than any individual member, which means no individual member is truly necessary to it, which means no individual member is truly safe from the pressure to be what the group needs rather than what they actually are. Quagmire's loneliness is the most invisible element of the friend group's dynamic. He presents as the one who least needs anything, the one who is most thoroughly occupied and most thoroughly satisfied by the pursuit that defines him. He is the one who always seems to be going somewhere interesting and doing something exciting. But the pattern of his pursuits, the compulsive, never-resolved quality of his sexual seeking, is the pattern of someone who has not found what he is looking for and keeps looking in the same place, because it is the only place he knows to look. The show gives Quagmire moments, scattered through the later seasons, where something real breaks through the surface. His sister's situation. His reaction to his father's gender transition, which the show handles with more sensitivity than its usual approach might suggest. The occasional glimpse of someone who built a life out of one dimension of experience and is faintly, rarely, almost secretly aware that the building was not complete. Section 9. Extended Quahog and the Imagination of Community. The town of Quahog, Rhode Island is worth one more extended visit, because it holds the show's most sustained argument, and that argument is about something we do not often think of as a fit subject for a comedy. It is an argument about belonging, about what it means to be from somewhere, about the specific texture of a life that is rooted in a particular place and a particular community, and that derives its meaning from that rootedness even when the place is imperfect and the community is failing. Most of the characters in Family Guy do not move. Not Peter and Lois, not Quagmire or Joe or Cleveland, during the seasons when he is present. Not most of the recurring supporting cast. They have been in this place for their adult lives and they will continue to be in it. The town is not a temporary way station on the way to something else. It is the destination. It is the whole place where the life happens. This is increasingly unusual as a structure for American life, as geographic mobility has increased across the decades the show spans. The idea that the place you are from is the place you stay is now, in many parts of America, a marker of limited options rather than of meaningful choice. People move for jobs, they move for opportunity, They move because the town they came from cannot offer what they need. And the people who stay, especially in working-class communities, are often the ones who stayed because they could not go, because the resources and the connections and the specific kinds of capital that enable mobility were not available to them. Family Guy does not make this argument explicitly. It does not analyze Quahog's place in the geography of American economic and social mobility. But it depicts over and over the specific quality of life in a place that holds its inhabitants because the holding is mutual. The town holds the characters because they have built themselves into it. They know its streets and its bars and its institutions and its peculiarities. They have history here. They have people here. The leaving would be a loss in all the ways that are hardest to calculate. The show is not romantic about Quahog. It is not saying this is a good place to live in any conventional sense. The institutions are failing. The community is fractured. The people are often terrible to each other in ways that specific communities develop specific traditions of being terrible to each other. But it is theirs. And the theirs is not nothing. It is, in fact, the thing that the show keeps treating as precious, even when everything else is being treated as a joke. The episode where the drunken clam is threatened with closure, which happens several times across the show's run in various configurations, always generates a response from the characters that is disproportionate to what a rationally calculating person would call for. It is not a nice bar. It is not irreplaceable in any market sense. There are other bars. But it is the bar. It is the specific one. And the losing of it would be the losing of something that cannot be replaced by substitution. Because what makes it valuable is not its characteristics, but its history, its accumulated meaning, its status as the place where these specific people have been, these specific people together. This is what community actually is when it works. Not a service that can be provided by an alternative vendor. Not a function that can be performed by a different institution. Something that has been built through time and presence and the particular friction of specific people in specific proximity. Family Guy, across its long run, understood this. The comedy is often at the community's expense. The affection is genuine. The mayor of Quahog, played in the show by the late Adam West, is himself a kind of comment on community leadership. He is not an effective mayor in any policy sense. His decisions are often bizarre, and his priorities are sometimes completely detached from the actual needs of his constituents. But he is present. He is visible. He is recognizable to the people he ostensibly serves. And in the world of the show, that visibility and that recognizability have a value that is separate from competence. West's death in 2017 prompted the show to retire the character rather than recast him, a decision that reflected the degree to which the character and the performer had become inseparable. The fictional mayor of Quahog died because the real Adam West died. And the show's willingness to absorb that reality, to let the death of the performer end the character rather than pretending it away, was its own kind of statement about what these fictional people mean to the people who make them and watch them. Section 10 extended the cutaway as a record of time. Let us close the loop on the cutaway gag with one more observation that we have not yet made, because it might be the most interesting one. The cutaway gag is, among other things, an archive. Family Guy has been on the air for over 25 years, and across those years, its cutaway gags have referenced an enormous range of cultural material from the 1950s through the present moment of each episode's production. The references span decades of film and television and music and political history and celebrity gossip and scientific development and sporting events and all the other categories of shared cultural reference that a show with Family Guy's range and its specific audience was drawing from. What this means is that watching Family Guy in order, from beginning to end, is a peculiar kind of time travel. The early cutaways reference the things that Peter Griffin, born in the late 1950s and reaching cultural awareness in the 1970s and 1980s, would have in his mental archive. The Star Wars references, the disco references, the specific texture of late 20th century American pop culture. Later cutaways move into the early 2000s, into the specific cultural moments of the post-9/11 America that the show was living in alongside its audience. Still, later ones move into the smartphone era, the social media era, the specific chaos of the 2010s. The show is not making a sophisticated argument about cultural change across time. It is not doing what a historical novelist does, using period detail to construct a comprehensive portrait of an era. But it is doing something adjacent to that. which is building a record of what a specific group of Americans were thinking about and laughing at and referencing across a very specific stretch of time. In 50 years, if Family Guy is studied by people who want to understand what American popular culture looked and felt like between 1999 and 2030, the cutaway gags will be some of the most useful primary sources available. Not because they are analytical or insightful about the period, but because they are from it. They are what the period thought was worth referencing. They are the specific jokes that a specific audience laughed at, and jokes are one of the best records we have of what a culture was anxious about, what it was trying to diffuse, what it needed to make small in order to bear. The Conway Twitty gag in this context is a joke about cultural obsolescence. Conway Twitty was a successful country singer. By the time Family Guy used him as a recurring gag, he was already decades past his cultural peak and largely unknown to the show's primary demographic. The joke is partly the absurdity of devoting several uninterrupted minutes of a primetime animated comedy to a full performance by a country singer that most of the audience has never heard of. But it is also, at some level, a joke about what happens to cultural figures after their moment has passed. They are still there, in the archive. Their work persists, but the world has moved on and cannot quite locate them anymore. Peter's relationship to the pop culture of his youth, his references to films and television shows and music from the 1970s and 1980s, is itself a kind of emotional archaeology. He returns to those references because they are the ones from the period when things felt most legible to him, when the culture was still the one he had been formed by and that had formed him. As the culture moved on, as the references became ones he did not share naturally, he kept reaching back. The nostalgia is not just aesthetic. It is an attempt to maintain continuity with the version of himself that came before all the accumulated changes. This is one of the most honest things about Peter Griffin's characterization. His attachment to the past is not stupidity. It is the completely ordinary human experience of finding the current moment less navigable than the one you grew up in, and of returning, repeatedly, to the touchstones that made navigation feel possible once. Section 11. Extended God, Death, and the Specific Theology of Family Guy. Let us spend more time with the theology, not the formal theology, not the academic tradition of arguing about God's nature and existence. The working theology, the practical, day-to-day relationship to the divine and to death that a specific kind of American household maintains, usually without examining it very directly. The Griffin family is Catholic, nominally, imperfectly, culturally Catholic in the way that a significant portion of American Catholic families are Catholic, which is to say they attend church, they observe certain rituals, they carry a framework of belief that is not always consistent with their actual behavior, but that serves important functions in their lives. The framework gives them a language for certain experiences. The rituals give them a structure for certain transitions. The community gives them a context for their specific lives. Peter's Catholicism is particularly interesting because it coexists, apparently without much difficulty, with his atheist dog, his evil genius baby, his pattern of behavior that is comprehensively inconsistent with most Catholic teaching, and his general inability to sustain any belief or value through more than one episode. He is Catholic in the way that he is many things, sincerely in the moments when it is convenient or comforting, and not particularly at any other time. This is not a critique of Peter. It is a description of something quite common. Faith, for many people, is less a consistent philosophical position and more a set of resources available in certain conditions. You call on it when you need it. It is there for you in the crises. It provides comfort at funerals and weddings and the birth of children, and the specific moments where the passage of time becomes most visible and most frightening. Outside of those moments, it sits quietly in the background, available but not active. The God who appears in Family Guy is, as we noted, a personalized and fallible deity, but he is also, in a way that the show does not always fully acknowledge, a response to a real psychological need. The people who populate Quahog need somewhere to take their fear. They need a container for the uncertainty, the fragility, the awareness of mortality that comes with being alive. God functions as that container. He is available to receive the things that cannot be managed otherwise. The show mocks this function, generally. The God who receives Peter's prayers is a God who is sometimes too busy to attend to them, or who attends to them in ways that are not what Peter had in mind, or who is occupied with his own concerns and only partially present to the supplicant. This is funny. It is also, if you look at it closely, an honest description of the experience of prayer as most people who pray actually have it. The prayer goes up. The response, if it comes, is ambiguous. The comfort comes not from a clear divine communication, but from the act of directing your fear towards something larger than yourself, and trusting that the direction has meaning even when the response is unclear. Brian's atheism, in this context, is not the absence of need. It is a decision about how to respond to the need without recourse to the available framework. Brian needs the same things that Peter's Catholicism is addressing. He needs a way to manage uncertainty and fear and the awareness of his own mortality. He has decided that the honest response is to not pretend that the framework is real and to find other resources instead. The drinking is one of those resources. The literary pretension is another. The friendship with Stewie is a third. None of them are as efficient as God, none of them are as clean, but they are honest in the specific way that Brian has decided honesty requires. Death, in the show's universe, is handled with the ambivalence that the subject deserves. It is funny when it is abstract, it is serious when it is close. This is the same relationship most people have to mortality, and the show, by depicting it rather than resolving it, is doing something accurate about human psychology. The character of Death himself, the Grim Reaper who appears in multiple episodes and who turns out to have a personal life of moderate interest, is the show's most explicit acknowledgement of the fact that death is a companion, not an interruption. He is always there. He has a schedule. He gets around. His presence in the show's universe normalizes mortality in the way that genuine engagement with the subject, rather than avoidance of it, tends to do. When you meet Death as a character, have a conversation with him, learn that he has his own problems and his own disappointments and his own bad days, the abstraction becomes something more navigable. He is not the end. He is a person with a job. And that is somehow both scarier and less scary than the alternative reading. The Brian and Stewie episode's most emotionally resonant moment, the gun in the safety deposit box, is the show's closest approach to what death contemplation actually feels like from the inside. Not the dramatic version, not the movie Suicide, but the quieter, more chronic version. The version that is not about despair so much as about the awareness that the option exists, that it is possible to choose to stop, that some days the choosing would require less effort than others. Brian does not describe suicidal ideation in clinical terms. He describes the specific, mundane management of his own lows through the precaution of distance. Keep the means far enough away that the bad day does not become the last day. This is an extremely honest thing for a primetime animated comedy to put in the mouth of one of its characters. It is honest in a way that is uncomfortable and also, for many viewers, uncomfortably recognizable. The show was not trying to do something radical here. It was trying to be honest about Brian's character. But the honesty, in this specific case, landed somewhere that a lot of viewers had been waiting to see acknowledged. Section 12. Extended the full weight of what was hidden. We have now spent a very long time inside Family Guy. We have looked at every major character and what they were carrying, at the town they inhabited and what it represented, at the formal choices the show made and what those choices were doing, at the big questions of religion and death and meaning that the show returned to again and again without always being willing to fully answer. What we find at the end of all this looking is a show that was braver than its reputation and more honest than its detractors gave it credit for. Not consistently brave, not unfailingly honest. A show with significant flaws and significant failures and significant moments where the commercial logic or the laziness or the drift away from the original creative vision produce something that is simply bad, that fails the characters and the audience and the ideas it was pretending to engage with. But also, a show that kept reaching, that kept returning to the same household and the same people and finding in them more material than a lesser creative enterprise would have found. A show that, at its best, understood that the ordinary is not the enemy of the interesting, that the domestic and the working class and the imperfect and the unresolved are not lesser subjects than the dramatic and the exceptional and the conclusive, that a family that stays together through 25 years of being terrible at being a family is telling you something true about families. The hidden message of Family Guy is distributed throughout the show in 1,000 small moments that the comedy covers and the shock value obscures and the flanderization and the cutaway overload sometimes buries entirely. You have to look for it. You have to be willing to look past the surface to find it. But it is there. It has always been in there. It says, "You are enough. The life you are in is enough to be the subject of a story. The love you are giving, even when it is given imperfectly and in the wrong direction and with the wrong emphasis, is real love. The community you are part of, even when it is failing and fractured and full of people who are not behaving well, is a real community worth belonging to. The dreams you have not accomplished, the novel that is not written and the ambition that has not been achieved and the person you imagined you would become, those things are real too. They are part of you. They do not cancel you. They are the evidence that you wanted more than you got, and that the wanting was itself worthwhile." This is what the show was saying under all the chicken fights, and the inappropriate cutaways and the extended gags, and the abuse of Meg that went too far, and the Brian that became insufferable, and the Peter that became cruel. Under all of it, this message, small, persistent, refusing to go away completely even when everything else about the show was pushing it aside. You watched a family for a long time. They were not a good family by most measures, but they were a family. They showed up for each other in the imperfect ways available to them across a very long run. And the showing up, the persistence, the refusal to let go of each other even when letting go would have been easier and maybe even healthier, that was the whole thing. That was the love. That was what the show was hiding underneath the comedy all along. It hid it well. Not everyone found it, but it was there, waiting for anyone patient enough to look. And so, very gently, we close this evening's conversation with the Griffin family. They are still in their house in Quahog, still imperfectly loving each other, still finding ways to be both terrible and tender, still, despite everything, together. I hope that in this long, slow drift through what Family Guy was really saying, something landed that you needed to hear, or something gave you company through a quiet night, or something simply made the darkness a little more interesting to rest inside. If you have been here with me for all of this, thank you. That is a long time to spend with any piece of analysis, and I do not take it for granted. If you want more like this, please subscribe. It helps more than you know, and it means these long, slow, atmospheric explorations will keep happening. Leave me a comment. Tell me where you are. Tell me what time it is. Those small details, someone in New Zealand at 2 in the morning, someone in Scotland watching through a November storm, someone in a warm apartment in a city I have never been to, they remind me why making this is worth the effort. Thank you for watching. Rest well. End of script. A final extended meditation, the show as a portrait of time. There is one more thing worth saying, and it is perhaps the thing that gives all the other observations their proper weight. Family Guy is not just a portrait of a family or a town or a set of characters. It is a portrait of time itself, of the specific passage of time in the life of a working-class American household across the first quarter of the 21st century. Time is the show's least discussed subject and perhaps its most important one. The Griffin family does not age in any conventional sense. Stewie is perpetually 1 year old. Meg is perpetually a teenager. Peter and Lois are permanently in their late 30s and early 40s. The children do not graduate and leave home. The seasons do not accumulate into the visible marks that years leave on real bodies and real lives. In the world of the show, time passes but does not land. The calendar moves, but the household remains constant. This is a formal choice, one that Family Guy shares with The Simpsons and most other long-running animated comedies. The permanent present of the animated sitcom is a genre convention, something the audience accepts as part of the deal they are making when they enter the show's universe. The characters will not change. The situations will not resolve into permanent conclusions. The status quo will reassert itself after every episode's crisis. But this convention carries meaning beyond its practical function. The permanent present of Family Guy is a kind of wish fulfillment. It is the fulfillment of the wish that the people we love will not change, that the household we grew up in will stay available, that the version of your parents and your siblings and your friends that you knew at a specific moment in your life will remain accessible to you, that you can go back to them at any time and find them exactly where you left them. This is not something the show could provide in reality, but animation can provide it in fiction. And the specific comfort of Family Guy, for audiences who grew up watching it and who have continued watching it across many years of their own lives, is partly the comfort of returning to this permanent present. You come back to the Griffins and they are where you left them. Peter is at the bar, Lois is in the kitchen, Meg is trying and the family is not quite seeing her. Brian is on the couch with his drink. Stewie is in his crib, building something. The comfort of that constancy, for viewers who have lived through marriages and divorces and deaths and job losses and the various unpredictable discontinuities that actual time delivers, is not trivial. It is the comfort of a specific kind of fiction that promises you that somewhere, in an animated Rhode Island suburb, things stay the same. The chaos is contained. The stakes are low enough that the crisis of this episode will be resolved before the next one begins. And yet, for all that formal constancy, the show does register time passing, not in the characters but in the world around them. The cultural references shift, the technology changes, smartphones appear and then are assumed. Social media becomes part of the background noise. The political landscape shifts visibly enough that the show's political jokes, which were relatively consistent in their targets through the 2000s, became more complicated and more contested as the decade turned and the American political situation became less legible. The show's relationship to the political moment it was embedded in is itself a kind of time capsule. Watching the early seasons, you can feel the specific quality of late 90s and early 2000s American political life, the relative comfort of the Clinton economy, the specific anxieties of the post-9/11 period, the particular flavor of the culture war debates that animated that era. Watching the later seasons, you feel the shift. The political material becomes harder-edged. The cultural fights become more direct. The America that Family Guy is depicting is not the same America as the one the show premiered in, and the show, often awkwardly, is trying to follow that change without losing its comedic footing. The show missed its step many times in navigating these shifts. Political episodes that aged poorly, jokes that were products of their moment rather than of genuine insight. Attempts to engage with specific current events that became dated almost immediately. But even in the failures, there is information. The failures are evidence of a show trying to stay present with the world it was embedded in, trying to remain relevant to an audience whose world was changing faster than the show's creative mechanisms could track. What the show was really saying about time, underneath all the formal conventions and all the cultural topicality, is something that applies to every family in every place and every era. It is that the time you have with the people you love is finite, that the specific configuration of a household, these people in this place at this moment, will not last, that children become adults and move away, that marriages change shape or end, that friends drift or die or move to different cities, that the version of your life that you are currently inside, however frustrating or insufficient or messy it sometimes feels, is also already becoming something you will look back on with a kind of complicated love. Family Guy's permanent present is a protection against this knowledge. But it is also, paradoxically, what makes the knowledge available. Because we watch the Griffins not change across 25 years while we change enormously, while we grow older and accumulate experience and loss in perspective, and the contrast between our movement and their stasis is itself a portrait of what time does. We become different people watching the same people, and the sameness of the people we are watching becomes a kind of measure of our own transformation. The viewer who watched Family Guy in 1999 as a college student is now in their late 40s. The viewer who watched it as a teenager in 2005 when it returned from cancellation is now in their early 30s. They have been watching this in a family, in the same house, in the same town, across all the years of their own adult formation. The Griffins did not change. They did. And the relationship between what stayed the same and what transformed is, in a strange and unintended way, one of the most honest things the show produces. The love for the show that many longtime fans feel is not just the love of a piece of entertainment, not just the comfort of something familiar that does not ask too much. It is the love of a mirror that kept reflecting you back at yourself, even as you moved away from who you were when you first looked. The Griffins are the constant and the viewer is the variable, and in that mathematical relationship, something true about time and about growing and about what we carry with us and what we put down is being expressed. This is the deepest hidden message of Family Guy, deeper than any of the specific character analyses or thematic observations we have made in this video. It is a message about the experience of watching something for a long time, about what happens to fiction when it is not a discrete, bounded object but an ongoing companion across years of a real life. About how the show that was there for you when you were 20 is a different show, somehow, than the one that is there when you are 40, even when nothing about the show itself has changed. You changed. The show stayed. And the conversation between those two facts, the show that is always itself and the viewer who is always becoming something new, is where the deepest meaning of Family Guy lives. It is the meaning that nobody planned and nobody could have, because it requires time to exist. It requires the years of returning and the years of change. It requires you to have been, at some point, younger than you are now, and to have found the Griffins there, exactly where you left them, exactly as they were. That is the real gift of a show that runs for 30 years. Not the specific episodes or the specific jokes or even the specific characters, though all of those matter. The gift is the fact of continued existence. The fact that when you come back, after all the years and all the things that happened in them, the light in the Griffin house is still on. These are the things that were hidden in Family Guy. Not hidden deliberately, not locked away behind the comedy with the intention of being discovered, hidden the way things are always hidden in the work of people who are being honest without being fully aware of it. Hidden in plain sight, in the texture of the characters and the quality of the world building and the formal choices and the long, slow accumulation of what it means to watch a family across a very long time. I hope this gave you something good to rest in tonight. I hope the words found you somewhere comfortable and left you a little more settled than before. Wherever you are, whatever the hour, whatever the weather outside your window, the light is still on in Quahog. The Griffins are still there. And so, slowly, are we? Subscribe if you want more nights like this one. And please, leave a comment, tell me where you are. That small thing, the note from a corner of the world I have never been to, is one of the best parts of making something and sending it out. Thank you, rest well. End of script. Total approximately 30,000 plus words. A closing meditation on watching and being watched. There is something that happens when you watch a piece of television across many years that does not happen with other art forms in quite the same way. A book is read and finished. A film is watched and ends. But a long-running television series is something you return to, episodically, across a stretch of your actual life. The show is woven into your history. The specific episodes are attached to specific memories of who you were when you watched them, where you were, what was happening in your life. The show becomes autobiographical in the way that companion experiences become autobiographical. For millions of people, Family Guy is exactly this kind of companion. They watched the first episodes when the show was new and they were young. They watched the Adult Swim reruns when the show was canceled and they stayed up too late. They celebrated the return in 2005. They watched through the years when the show was at its best and the years when it was clearly not. They are still watching now, in some cases, because the Griffins have become part of the furniture of their inner life in a way that is not easily explained or easily removed. The specific texture of Family Guy's humor, which relies so heavily on shared cultural reference, on the audience recognizing the thing being referenced and then appreciating the angle the show is taking on it, creates a particular kind of bond between the show and its audience. It is the bond of shared knowledge, of a wink between people who know the same things, of the comedy that requires a particular kind of background to receive, and that excludes people who do not share that background, and that in the excluding creates a stronger bond among those who are included. This is not always a flattering quality. The comedy that depends on in-group knowledge can become exclusive in ways that are harmful, that draw lines between who is in on the joke and who is the subject of it. Family Guy has, at various points in its run, crossed into this territory, making jokes that required the audience to be complicit in a particular kind of dismissal to find them funny. The megabuse, at its worst, asked the audience to share in the contempt. The jokes at the expense of various marginalized groups asked the audience to choose between laughing and registering that the laugh was at someone's expense. Not all of the show's audience made the second choice. Not all of the time. But the fact that the show persisted and that its audience remained large despite these moments says something about how comedy works and what it asks of us. Comedy creates a temporary community. For the duration of the joke, we are all in the same place together. The question of what we are doing in that place together, whether we are sharing in something worthwhile or sharing in something harmful, is one that requires the individual viewer to bring their own judgment to bear. Family Guy, at its best, created communities around genuine warmth, around the recognition of something true, around the specific joy of watching something imperfect make itself legible. At its worst, it created communities around shared contempt and exclusion. The long run of the show contains both, and perhaps the most honest response to it is to hold both truths simultaneously, to acknowledge what it got wrong without dismissing what it got right, to receive the warmth that was genuinely offered while being clear about the moments when the warmth was a front for something less generous. The show was made by human beings, which means it was made by people who had the full human range of capacities. The capacity for insight and the capacity for cruelty. The capacity for warmth and the capacity for laziness. The capacity for honesty and the capacity for self-deception. All of those capacities are present in the work. You can see all of them if you look long enough. What the show offers at the end of 25 plus years is not a masterpiece. It is something more interesting than a masterpiece, because a masterpiece is a fixed thing, a perfect object, complete and self-contained. What Family Guy offers is a relationship. Imperfect, complicated, sometimes deeply frustrating, occasionally genuinely moving, always in process. A relationship with a fictional family that is also, in various ways, a relationship with yourself, with the version of yourself that first found these characters funny, and the version that has been watching them ever since. That is worth something. It is worth a lot, actually. The long-form, imperfect, ongoing relationship with a piece of popular culture is one of the ways that human beings make meaning out of the passing of time. We return to the things we love. We find them changed by our changing even when they themselves have not changed. We bring ourselves to them and take ourselves away from them and come back again, and the coming back is its own kind of statement about what we value and what we cannot let go of. Family Guy will keep going for a while yet. The renewal deals are in place. The business case is solid. The Griffins will be on screen, unchanged, for years to come, and millions of people will watch them, in bedrooms and living rooms and on phones held up in dark rooms while they try to fall asleep, and they will laugh at some of the jokes and be bored by others and occasionally, unexpectedly, feel something they did not quite expect to feel when they sat down to watch a cartoon about a silly family in Rhode Island. That feeling is the thing. That is what was always being made, underneath the comedy and the shock value and the cutaway gags and the flanderization and all the other qualities that critics have rightly or wrongly assigned to the show. The thing that was always being made was something you could feel, something that connected, something that in the right moment, at the right time of night, in the right configuration of tiredness and loneliness or company or whatever the specific quality of the evening was, reached through the screen and said, "I see you. Your life is a story. Your ordinary is enough." That is Family Guy's hidden message, distributed across every episode, buried in every imperfect joke, present even in the moments when the show was worst. The persistence of the message, its refusal to be entirely extinguished even by the show's own worst tendencies, is itself proof of something. Of the care that went into building the original characters. Of the love that the original writers had for the world they were making. Of the fact that something genuinely human was placed at the center of this enterprise, and that the genuinely human thing is stubborn and tends to survive even when everything around it is working against it. The light is on in Quahog. It has been on for more than 25 years. And on whatever night you find yourself watching, whatever the hour and whatever the mood, the Griffins are there, unchanged, waiting, exactly where you left them. You are allowed to rest now. The story will still be there when you wake up. Script end. The last thing worth saying. I want to say one final thing before we really close this evening, and it is something that does not fit neatly into any of the sections we have worked through, but that has been running underneath all of them like a groundwater current. Family Guy, for all of its faults, for all the ways it failed its characters and its audience and its own best instincts, was also a show that was made by people who were trying to do something. Not always successfully. Not always with the right tools or the right instincts or the right amount of care, but trying. The writers who worked on it across its run, who turned up every week and broke stories and wrote drafts and argued about what the characters would do and what the jokes should be, were doing the work that creative labor requires, which is the work of trying to make something that resonates, of reaching for an audience and hoping the reach connects. The audience reached back. Not always in the ways the show intended, not always toward the best version of what the show was offering. But the reaching was real and the response was real, and the conversation between the show and the people who watched it, across 25 years of Sunday nights and Wednesday nights, and late-night Adult Swim reruns and streaming queues, and late-night phone screen watches in dark bedrooms, that conversation was real. That conversation is what a long-running piece of popular entertainment actually is, when it works. Not a product being consumed, a conversation being had. With yourself, with the characters, with the cultural moment, with the versions of yourself that watched this thing at different points in your life and brought different things to it and took different things away. The conversation is not over. It will not be over for a long time yet. The Griffins will keep being the Griffins. The light in Quahog will keep being on. And people, in their various configurations of tiredness and company and loneliness and warmth, will keep finding their way to the couch where Peter is probably sitting with a beer, thinking about something he will immediately forget, surrounded by a family that is imperfect and present and his. It is enough. It has always been enough. Good night wherever you are. I am glad you spent this time here. I hope you rest well and wake up to something good. One more voice in the dark. Let me leave you with one more observation, quiet enough that it might slip past you if you are already drifting towards sleep, which is perfectly fine. That is what this is for. The characters in Family Guy are loud. The comedy is loud. The shock value is loud. But the things the show was actually saying, underneath all of that noise, were whispered. They were the low-frequency broadcast, the thing that you do not hear with your ears so much as feel in your chest when something that is true arrives in a form you recognize. The truth that the show was whispering was always the same, that the people around you, imperfect as they are worth your attention, that the life you have, messy as it is worth telling stories about, that ordinary love, given badly and received imperfectly and sustained through sheer stubborn habit across years and decades, is still love. That ordinary friendship, built around tables and bars that are not very impressive, maintained through the repeated act of showing up, is still friendship. That ordinary courage, the courage of getting up and trying again after failing yesterday and probably failing tomorrow, is still courage. Peter Griffin gets up every day and tries. Not well, not wisely, not with any great success rate, but he gets up, he goes to work, he comes home, he loves his family in the sideways, impractical, frequently damaging way available to a man who did not receive a great education in how love is supposed to look. And the show watches him do this across all those years, and it does not turn away. It keeps watching. It keeps finding the thing in him that is worth watching. That is the gift, the sustained, unblinking, comedic, but genuine attention to a particular kind of life. The refusal to look away. The insistence that this is interesting, that this matters, that you matter, whoever you are, watching this in the dark, ordinary as you are, imperfect as you are, exactly as you are. Thank you for being here. Rest now.